Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that lingers at the edges of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. One that the scholars of the Imperium would rather not ask. One that the Inquisition would likely burn you for even considering. And one that the Orks themselves would never think to pose, because thinking too hard about anything gives them a headache. What would happen if the Orks raised a human child? Not as livestock, not as a slave to be worked until the bones gave out and the spirit broke, but raised, in whatever broken and brutal fashion the greenskins are capable of, as one of their own. It is a question that sits uncomfortably between horror and fascination, between the grim darkness of the far future and something almost approaching dark comedy, because if there is one truth about the Orks that the Imperium has never fully grasped, it is that they are not simply monsters. They are an entire civilization, crude and savage and endlessly violent, but a civilization nonetheless, with customs, hierarchies, beliefs, and a way of looking at the universe that is so utterly alien to human understanding that to even attempt the comparison is to risk losing your mind. And yet the comparison must be made, because the question demands it. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the sounds of the world around you fade into the background, and let us walk together through one of the strangest, most disturbing, and most oddly compelling thought experiments the 41st millennium has to offer. Let us imagine a child, a human infant, somehow separated from everything it has ever known, somehow placed into the calloused, the green-skinned hands of a species that treats warfare the way most races treat breathing. Let us imagine what that child would become. But before we can answer that question, before we can even begin to trace the path of this impossible life, we need to understand the world that child would be entering. We need to understand the Orks, not the simplified version, not the green-skinned comedic relief that some corners of the fandom reduce them to, but the full, terrifying, awe-inspiring, and yes, sometimes genuinely funny reality of what the greenskins are and what they represent in the broader galaxy. Because the Orks are not what they first appear to be. They never have been. On the surface, they seem simple. They are big, green, loud, and violent. They hit things. They shoot things. They build ramshackle machines out of scrap metal and prayers to gods who may or may not actually exist in any meaningful sense. They scream their way across the stars in ships that look like they were assembled by a toddler with a welder and a grudge, and they crash into planet after planet with the grace of a drunken avalanche. They have no art that doesn't involve skulls. They have no music that doesn't involve screaming. They have no cuisine that doesn't involve things that were still moving 5 minutes ago. They are, to use a technical term, an absolute mess. And yet they are the most successful species in the entire galaxy. By raw numbers, by sheer territorial spread, by the simple metric of survival, the Orks have won. They have already won. They outnumber humanity. They outnumber the Eldari. They may even outnumber the Tyranids. Though that comparison gets complicated when you start trying to count individual organisms in a hive mind. The Orks are everywhere, on every world, in every system, in every corner of every segmentum. They are a galactic constant, as reliable as entropy and considerably louder. This is not an accident. This is by design, design that stretches back millions of years to the ancient and enigmatic race known as the Old Ones, those reptilian creators who shaped the galaxy's biological destiny during the war in heaven. The Old Ones created the Orks, or rather, they created the Krork, the precursor species from which the modern Orks are believed to have descended. They created them as weapons, as biological war machines, designed to fight and die and fight again against the Necrons and the star gods known as the Citan. And they did their job remarkably well. The Old Ones built redundancy into every aspect of the Ork design. They built them tough, with thick bones filled with a spongy fungal matter that replaces the simple marrow found in human skeletons. They built them resilient, with a physiology that combines animal and fungal elements into a symbiotic whole that can survive injuries that would kill a human 3 times over. They built them aggressive, with a brain structure that prioritizes combat instincts and pack behavior above all else. And most importantly, they built them to reproduce through spores, tiny fungal cells released throughout an orc's life and in massive quantities upon death, ensuring that wherever the greenskins go, they leave behind the seeds of future generations. This spore-based reproduction is the key to everything. But it is why the orcs are everywhere. It is why they cannot be eradicated. It is why every world they touch becomes a permanent battleground, because those spores burrow into the ground and grow, producing first the simplest orcoid life forms, the squigs, those bizarre and often terrifying creatures that serve as the foundation of the entire greenskin ecosystem. Then come the snotlings, tiny infantile greenskins who tend the fungal gardens and cultivate the squigs. Then the Gretchen, the small, cunning, cowardly servants who build the first settlements and establish the rudiments of society. And finally, the orcs themselves emerge, fully formed, already hardwired for violence, already carrying within their DNA the instinctive knowledge of how to fight, how to build crude weapons, and how to speak the guttural language of their kind. This is the world our hypothetical human child would be entering. Not a family in any recognizable sense, not a home, not a nursery, a living, breathing, spore-generating ecosystem of violence and survival, where the only law that matters is the oldest law of all. Might makes right. The biggest orc is the boss. The strongest voice is the one that gets heard. And everything else, everyone else, exists to serve, to fight, or to die. Now, how does a human baby end up in this situation? The 40,000 universe, being what it is, provides no shortage of plausible scenarios. Planetary invasions are a daily occurrence across the galaxy. Orc hordes crash into human worlds with the subtlety of a meteor strike, and in the chaos that follows, in the burning cities and the screaming populations, and the desperate last stands of planetary defense forces, our children get separated from parents, families get torn apart, babies get left behind in the rubble of collapsed buildings or the wreckage of fleeing vehicles. An orc warband sweeping through the ruins of a conquered city could easily stumble across an infant, wailing in the dust, too small and too helpless to even crawl away. In most cases, the fate of such a child would be swift and terrible. Orcs are not known for their mercy, and a screaming human infant would typically be regarded as either a nuisance to be silenced or a snack to be consumed. The law is quite clear on this point. Orcs regularly take human slaves, working them in brutal labor camps until their bodies give out. On some conquered worlds, orcs have been known to breed human captives like livestock, keeping them in pens of total darkness, and feeding them just enough to keep the meat on their bones. The novels of the 40,000 universe paint a picture of orc slavery that is far removed from the comedic tone of the tabletop game. In the books, orc captivity is a grinding, dehumanizing horror that strips away everything a person is until nothing remains but a broken animal waiting for the end. But we are not asking about the typical case. We are asking about the exception. We are asking what happens when, for whatever reason, an orc or a group of orcs decides not to eat the baby, not to toss it aside, not to use it as ammunition for a particularly creative weapon, but to keep it, to raise it, to treat it, in whatever distorted way greenskin psychology allows, as something approaching a member of the tribe. Why would this happen? Several possibilities present themselves, and each one tells us something different about the orcs and the strange corners of their brutal culture. The first and most likely scenario involves the runthirds, the orc specialists who are genetically predisposed to herding and managing smaller creatures. Runthirds are the shepherds of orc society, the ones who wrangle the Gretchen and snotlings into something approaching productivity. They use squig hounds and grabber sticks to keep their charges in line, and they take a certain professional pride in their ability to control creatures smaller and weaker than themselves. A runthird. Finding a human infant might regard it the same way he regards a particularly unusual squig, as a curiosity worth keeping, a new specimen for his collection of runts and oddities. The child would not be treated with kindness in any human sense of the word, but it would be kept alive, fed, and managed alongside the other small creatures in the Runtherd's care. The second possibility involves the Pain Boys, the orc equivalent of doctors, though calling them doctors is a bit like calling a tornado a gentle breeze. Pain Boys are driven by an insatiable curiosity about biology, a genetically encoded urge to cut things open and see how they work. They are notorious for performing experimental surgeries on unwilling patients, transplanting squig brains into orc skulls, attaching extra limbs where no limbs should be, and generally treating the concept of medical ethics as a quaint suggestion that doesn't apply to them. A pain boy finding a human infant might see it as the ultimate research project, a chance to study how a completely different species develops from infancy. Not out of scientific altruism, of course, but out of the same morbid fascination that drives a child to pull the wings off a fly. The pain boy would keep the child alive because a dead specimen is less interesting than a living one. And over the years, as the child grows, the pain boy's interest might evolve into something that, if you squinted very hard and turned your head at just the right angle, might almost resemble attachment. The third possibility, and perhaps the most interesting one from a lore perspective, involves the Blood Axes clan. The Blood Axes are the black sheep of orc society, the clan that other orcs regard with deep suspicion and open contempt because of their willingness to engage with human culture. The Blood Axes were the first orc clan to encounter the Imperium of man, and that prolonged exposure left a lasting mark on their culture. They adopted human tactics like camouflage and tactical retreats. They learned to trade instead of simply stealing. They have even worked as mercenaries for Imperial forces on occasion, selling their services for weapons and equipment. Other orc clans consider them dangerously un-orky, cowardly traitors who have been corrupted by contact with the soft pink things that go squish too easily. A Blood Axes warband would be the most likely group of orcs to intentionally keep a human child, not out of kindness, but out of the same pragmatic cunning that defines their entire culture. A human raised among Blood Axes could serve as an interpreter, a spy, a go-between for future dealings with the Imperium. The Blood Axes are smart enough to see long-term value in things that other orcs would discard. And a human who speaks both Low Gothic and Orcish, who understands both cultures from the inside, would be an incredibly valuable asset. The Blood Axes might raise the child the way they raise everything else, roughly, pragmatically, and with an eye toward eventual usefulness, but they would raise it nonetheless. There is also the possibility of simple accident, the kind of chaotic, unplanned circumstance that defines so much of orc society. Perhaps a Gretchen takes the baby, thinking it is some kind of strange pink hairless squig, and hides it in the warren of tunnels and hovels, where the Gretchen conduct their secret economy of fungus beer and roasted squig snacks. The Gretchen, in being naturally more cunning and less violent than their orc masters, might feed the child and keep it hidden, using it as a novelty, a conversation piece, a way to earn a few extra teeth from curious orcs who have never seen a baby human up close. Over time, as the child grows and begins to walk and talk, its presence in the settlement becomes an established fact, and established facts in orc society tend to persist as long as no one gets angry enough to change them. Whatever the specific circumstances, the result is the same. A human child, alone in a world of green, surrounded by creatures that could crush it with a casual backhand, begins the long, strange, painful process of growing up among the orcs. And everything about that process, every single aspect of it, or it would be shaped by the fundamental nature of greenskin society, and the vast, unbridgeable differences between human and orc psychology. Let us begin with the most basic and most important difference, the one that underlies everything else. Orcs have no concept of love. The lore is explicit on this point. Orcs find the entire idea of human affection strange and inexplicable, like trying to explain color to a species that sees only in shades of grey. They have no word for it in their language. They have no cultural framework for understanding it. The closest thing an orc experiences to an emotional bond is what might be called battle bliss, the fierce, visceral joy of combat, the rush of adrenaline and aggression that comes from fighting a worthy opponent. An orc might feel something approaching camaraderie toward a fellow fighter who has proven himself in battle, but it is not love. It is not even friendship in the human sense. It is more like the respect one predator feels for another, an acknowledgement of strength and capability that persists only as long as that strength is demonstrated. This means that the human child growing up among orcs would never experience what most human children take for granted. There would be no gentle hands, no soft words, no bedtime stories, no comfort when the nightmares came. There would be no one to explain the world in terms a child could understand, no one to set boundaries with patience and care, no one to provide the emotional scaffolding that human psychology requires for healthy development. Instead, there would be rough handling, loud voices, casual violence, and the constant, overwhelming pressure to survive in an environment that was never designed for human habitation. The child would learn, very quickly, that crying brings not comfort, but danger. The sound of a wailing infant would attract the attention of nearby orcs, and that attention would almost never be positive. Orcs respond to weakness the way sharks respond to blood, with a predatory interest that rarely ends well for the weak party. The child would learn to be quiet, to be small, to stay out of the way, to make itself invisible in a world where visibility meant vulnerability. These are the lessons that slave children learn on orc-conquered worlds, and they are lessons that are burned into the psyche with the permanence of a brand. But our hypothetical child is not a slave, or at least not only a slave. It is being raised, however roughly, as part of the community. It has a protector of some kind, a runtherd who considers it his property, a pain boy who considers it his experiment, a bloodaxe's knob who considers it his investment. This protection, thin and unreliable as it might be, makes all the difference. It means the child survives the first year, then the second, then the third. It means the child lives long enough to begin learning, to begin adapting, to begin the process of transformation that will turn a helpless human infant into something the galaxy has rarely seen, a human who thinks, speaks, and fights like an orc. And that transformation, that slow and terrible metamorphosis from one kind of being to another, is where our story truly begins. The first thing the child would learn is the language. Orc speech is a guttural and a simplified form of communication that conveys meaning through a combination of crude words, contextual grunts, and the sheer volume at which everything is delivered. It is not a subtle language. There are no love poems in Orcish, no philosophical treatises, no legal codes or diplomatic protocols. The vocabulary is heavily weighted toward concepts of violence, hierarchy, and possession. There are dozens of words for different types of fighting, different categories of weapons, different degrees of destruction. There are precise terms for the relative sizes of explosions. There is a rich and nuanced vocabulary for describing the quality of a good scrap, but there are almost no words for the inner life, for the complex emotional states that define human experience. A human child raised from infancy in this linguistic environment would develop a strikingly different internal world than a child raised speaking Low Gothic or any other human language. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that language shapes thought, suggests that a child who grows up with a limited vocabulary for emotional expression would develop a limited capacity for emotional introspection. The child would know anger, because anger is everywhere in orc society. It would know fear, because fear is the primary survival mechanism for anything smaller than a full-grown orc. It would know a crude form of satisfaction, the feeling of a full belly or a successful scavenging run. But the more complex emotional states, the ones that require a richer vocabulary and a more supportive social environment, love, grief, nostalgia, hope, these might remain forever stunted, never quite developing to their full human potential. This does not mean the child would be emotionless. Human psychology is remarkably resilient, and the capacity for emotion is hardwired into our neurology at a level that no amount of environmental deprivation can completely suppress. The child would feel things, deep and powerful things, but it might lack the language and the conceptual framework to understand what it was feeling. It might experience a strange ache when watching the Gretchen huddle together for warmth, not knowing that what it was feeling was loneliness. It might feel a surge of something fierce and protective when a younger slave was threatened, not recognizing the feeling as compassion. It would carry these unnamed emotions like stones in its pockets, and heavy and ever-present, but never quite comprehended. The second thing the child would learn is the hierarchy. Orc society is brutally simple in its organization. The biggest orc is the boss. The second biggest orc is the second in command, and so on, all the way down to the smallest snotling at the very bottom of the pile. This hierarchy is maintained through constant physical violence, casual beatings that serve as both communication and governance. An orc who feels he has grown big enough to challenge his superior will do so, loudly and publicly, and the winner of the resulting fight becomes the new boss. There is no appeal, no due process, no higher authority to petition. There is only strength. For a human child in this environment, the hierarchy would be painfully clear. Humans are small. Humans are weak. Humans are, what's in the eyes of Orc society, somewhere around the level of a Gretchen, perhaps slightly below. The child would learn its place through the same mechanism that every creature in Orc society learns its place, through being hit by things bigger than itself and hitting things smaller than itself. It would learn to dodge the casual backhand of a passing Orc boy, to scurry out of the way when the knobs came stomping through, to fight viciously for scraps of food against Gretchen, who were just as hungry and considerably more experienced at the art of petty theft. But here is where something interesting begins to happen. Unlike a Gretchen, who accepts its place in the hierarchy with a kind of resigned acceptance because its Orc genes code for a certain baseline of subservience, a human child carries within it the seed of something that Orc society has never quite been able to stamp out in its slaves. Ambition, not the Orcish kind of ambition, which is simply the desire to be bigger and to hit things harder, but the human kind, the complex, multifaceted drive to improve one's circumstances through whatever means are available. Where a Gretchen sees the hierarchy and thinks, that's just how things are, a human child might look at the same hierarchy and think, how do I work around this? This is the spark. This is the thing that would set the human child apart from every other non-Orc creature in the settlement. Not strength, because it would never be as strong as an Orc. Not toughness, because even the hardiest human is fragile compared to a greenskin. But cunning, the human capacity for lateral thinking, but for seeing opportunities where others see only obstacles, for planning ahead in a way that Orcs rarely bother to do. And in Orc society, cunning is not merely tolerated. It is respected. The Orcs have a word for it. They call it being kunin, and it is one of the two supreme virtues of their culture, the other being brutality. An Orc who is both brutal and cunning is the ideal Orc, the kind of leader who attracts followers and builds empires. And while a human can never be brutal in the Orcish sense, a human raised among Orcs from infancy might develop a degree of cunning that even the blood axes would find impressive. This cunning would manifest in the child's early years as a talent for manipulation and misdirection. Unable to compete physically with even the smallest Orc, the child would learn to survive through other means, and it would learn which Orcs could be bribed with fungus beer and which ones should simply be avoided. It would learn the tells that indicated when a Gretchen was about to steal from it, and how to position itself so that the thieving grot got caught by an irritated Orc instead. It would learn the complex web of rivalries and alliances that defines Orc social life, and it would learn to navigate that web with a deftness that no greenskin could match, because no greenskin has the human capacity for reading social situations and adjusting behavior accordingly. In time, This cunning would earn the child a grudging respect from certain elements of Orc society. Not from the Orcs themselves, who would always see it as a runt, but from the Gretchen, who would recognize a kindred spirit. The Gretchen are the entrepreneurs of Orc society, or the wheelers and dealers who operate a thriving black market economy beneath the notice of their larger masters. They sell fungus beer, roast squigs on sticks, coordinate betting on fights, and loot corpses for fun and profit. A human child who demonstrated an aptitude for this kind of scheming would find itself welcomed, cautiously and provisionally, into the Gretchen underground. This would be the child's first real community, its first experience of belonging to a group, even if that group was a collection of cowardly, thieving, perpetually terrified little green creatures who would sell each other out in a heartbeat if the price was right. Among the Gretchen, the child would learn the art of survival in its most refined form. It would learn to cook, because Gretchen do most of the cooking in Orc society. Yes, and a human who could prepare food that actually tasted good by Orc standards, which is admittedly a very low bar, would be a valuable member of the camp. It would learn basic mechanics, because Gretchen assist the mech boys in their workshops, and a pair of small, dexterous human hands can reach places that even a Gretchen's nimble fingers cannot. It would learn the rhythms and routines of camp life, the times when it was safe to move about freely, and the times when it was best to disappear into the shadows and wait for the violence to pass. And it would learn something else, something that would shape its identity for the rest of its life. It would learn the stories, the songs, the myths, the religion, because Orcs have a religion, and it is as simple and as powerful as everything else about them. They worship two gods, Gork and Mork. And the difference between the two is the kind of theological subtlety that can start a war, which, being Orcs, it frequently does. Gork is brutal but cunning. Mork is cunning but brutal. The distinction, such as it is, boils down to this. Gork hits you hard when you are looking at him, and Mork hits you when you are not looking. Both gods are manifestations of the Orc species' collective psyche in the warp, the mirror of greenskin nature rendered into divine form, and they represent the two fundamental values that drive all of Orc civilization: strength and cleverness, power and trickery, the fist and the feint. A human child raised in this religious environment would absorb these beliefs the way any child absorbs the beliefs of the culture it grows up in, not through conscious decision but through osmosis, through constant exposure. Through the accumulated weight of 1,000 stories told around campfires and 1,000 prayers shouted before battle, the child would learn to invoke Gork and Mork in its own moments of crisis, to mutter greenskin prayers when danger threatened, to believe, with the simple faith of someone who has never known any other way, that the universe is fundamentally a place of glorious violence presided over by two enormously powerful gods, who are themselves engaged in an eternal, magnificent brawl. This would be a strange and terrible form of religious education, but it would also be a deeply sincere one. Orc faith is not performative. It is not ritual for the sake of ritual. When an Orc prays to Gork or Mork, he does so with the absolute conviction that his gods are real, that they are watching, and that they approve of violence done in their name. And this conviction is not misplaced, because the Orc gods are real, at least as real as anything else in the warp. They are sustained by the collective psychic energy of billions upon billions of greenskins, a gestalt field of belief and aggression so powerful that it can bend reality itself, making Orc technology work when it shouldn't, making red vehicles go faster because every Orc believes they do, making yellow explosions bigger because that is what the cultural consensus demands. The Orc gods are the embodiment of the greenskin collective unconscious, and they are as powerful and as terrifying as the species that gave them form. For the human child, this religious education would create a profound and irresolvable conflict. On one level, the child would genuinely believe in Gork and Mork, having been raised from birth in a culture that takes their existence for granted. On another level, the human brain, with its capacity for abstract thought and existential questioning, might begin to sense that something is not quite right, that the universe might be larger and more complicated than the greenskin theology suggests. This tension between inherited belief and dawning doubt would be one of the defining features of the child's inner life, a source of confusion and discomfort that it would carry with it always, never quite able to resolve. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the child can wrestle with questions of theology and identity, it must first survive. And survival, in an Ork settlement, is a daily challenge that requires every ounce of the child's growing cunning and rapidly developing physical abilities. Let us talk about the physical realities of growing up among Orks, because they are as important as the psychological ones. A human body growing in an Ork environment would be subject to conditions that no pediatrician in any civilized society would approve of. The diet would be atrocious, consisting primarily of fungus, squig meat, and whatever else the Gretchen managed to scavenge or steal. Ork cuisine, if it can be called that, is not designed with human nutritional needs in mind. The fungus that forms the staple of greenskin diet is an orkoid organism, adapted over millions of years to nourish orkoid physiology, and its nutritional value for a human would be questionable at best. The child would likely suffer from chronic malnutrition, stunted growth, and a host of vitamin deficiencies that would leave lasting marks on its physical development. The environment itself would be hostile in ways that go beyond simple neglect. Ork settlements are loud, filthy, and saturated with the spores that the greenskins constantly shed. These spores are designed to grow into new orkoid life forms, and while they are not infectious to humans in the reproductive sense, the constant exposure to alien biological material would pose a significant health risk. The air in an Ork camp is thick with the smell of fungus, engine oil, smoke, and the particular musk of greenskin bodies, a scent that human noses find deeply unpleasant, but that the child would eventually become so accustomed to that it no longer registered. As the child would breathe this air, eat this food, and drink water that had been filtered through orkoid fungal systems, and somehow, against all odds, it would survive. Because human beings, for all their relative fragility, are extraordinarily adaptable creatures, and a child who grows up in harsh conditions develops a tolerance for those conditions that an adult never could. The child would also face constant physical danger, not from deliberate malice, but from the casual violence that permeates every aspect of Ork life. Orks fight constantly. They fight over food, over territory, over weapons, over insults real and imagined, over theological disagreements about which god is which, and sometimes simply because they haven't hit anything in a while and the urge is becoming unbearable. These fights are a normal part of daily life, and as routine and unremarkable as conversation, and they erupt without warning in every corner of the settlement. A child living in this environment would need to develop an almost preternatural sense of spatial awareness, an ability to read the body language of Orks and predict when violence was about to break out, combined with the speed and agility to get out of the way before a flying Gretchen or a stray bullet turned a nearby brawl into a personal emergency. Over years of this kind of training, the child's reflexes would become extraordinary. Not in the superhuman sense, not like a space marine or an Aeldari, but in the very human sense of a nervous system that has been honed by constant danger into something sharper and more responsive than nature intended. But the child would develop the kind of awareness that soldiers call combat sense, the ability to feel danger before it materializes, to read the micro-expressions and postural shifts that precede violence, to react to threats with a speed and decisiveness that comes not from genetic engineering, but from simple, brutal experience. This physical development would be complemented by a growing understanding of Ork combat techniques. The child would watch, from its hiding places and its vantage points among the Gretchen warrens, as Orks trained and fought and killed. It would see how the bigger Orks used their size and strength to dominate, how the commandos use stealth and surprise, how the Stormboys use speed and reckless aggression. It would absorb these lessons the way it absorbed everything else, unconsciously and instinctively, building a mental library of combat knowledge that it would one day need to deploy in its own defense. Because eventually, inevitably, the child would have to fight. Not the play fighting of the Gretchen, the pinching and biting and scrabbling that passed for social interaction among the smaller greenskins, but a real fight against a real opponent with real consequences. Perhaps a Gretchen grown too bold in its bullying. Perhaps a young orc, barely past his own emergence, looking for an easy target to establish his place in the hierarchy. Perhaps a squig that had escaped its pen and was now rampaging through the camp with the mindless ferocity that squigs are famous for. The first real fight would be the crucible, the moment that defined the child's place in orc society for years to come. Win, and it would earn a measure of respect, however grudging. Lose, and it would be marked as prey, as a target for every bully and opportunist in the camp. The stakes would be as high as they could possibly be, and the child, drawing on every survival instinct it had developed, every lesson it had absorbed, every ounce of the cunning that was its birthright as a human being, would have to find a way to prevail. And this is where the story of the orc-raised human begins to diverge from the story of the orc-raised slave. A slave fights because it must. A member of the community fights because it belongs. And belonging, in orc society, is not a matter of birth or blood or species. It is a matter of contribution. It is a matter of proving, every single day, that you have a right to be here, that you serve a purpose, and that the resources spent on keeping you alive are returned in the form of value to the tribe. The human child, if it survived its first real fight, if it found a way to contribute to the settlement's chaotic economy, if it earned its place through cunning and usefulness and sheer, stubborn refusal to die, would begin to be seen as something other than a slave or a pet or a curiosity. It would become, in the peculiar and uniquely orcish understanding of the term, a member of the tribe. Not an orc, never an orc, but something that had a name in orcish, a place in the hierarchy, a role to play in the grand and glorious business of fighting everything that needed to be fought. And that something, that strange and unprecedented thing, would be the beginning of one of the most unusual lives the 41st millennium could produce. Now, to understand the full scope of what this child's life would become, we need to go deeper into the structure of orc society, into the intricate web of clans, castes, and customs that govern greenskin existence. Because orc society, for all its apparent chaos, is not random. It follows rules, ancient rules encoded into the greenskin genome by the old ones millions of years ago, rules that produce the same social structures and cultural patterns wherever orcs are found. From the feral tribes of backwater worlds to the massive spacefaring empires of legendary war bosses like Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka. The basic unit of orc society is the warband, a loose collection of orcs, Gretchen, and snotlings, organized around a central leader, the war boss, who maintains his authority through the simple and time-honored method of being bigger and meaner than everyone else.
Honestly, this is one of those topics that just lives in my head rent-free. I started looking into this because someone left a comment asking about it, and I thought, yeah, that's a 15-minute video at best. But the deeper I went, the more I realized there's so much layered into this question that nobody really talks about. The biology alone kept me up reading wiki pages for way too long, and what gets me every time is that the 40,000 universe has this reputation for being all vultures and chainswords and, massive battles, but the stuff that actually haunts you is the quiet horror. A kid growing up not knowing what it is, not having a word for loneliness because the species around it never feels lonely. This is the kind of thing that sticks with you after you close the book or turn off the game. I think that is why I keep coming back to these weird what-if scenarios, because they force you to look at the lore from an angle that the tabletop and the novels do not always explore. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's go back to the video.
A warband can be as small as a handful of orcs squabbling over a pile of scrap, or as large as a full-scale military formation numbering in the thousands. But the basic structure remains the same. The war boss at the top. The knobs, the largest and most experienced warriors, serving as his lieutenants. The boys, the rank-and-file fighters who make up the bulk of the warband. And beneath them all, the vast underclass of Gretchen and Snotlings who do the work that the Orks can't be bothered to do themselves. Multiple warbands come together to form a tribe, and tribes are the largest stable social unit in Ork society. A tribe is usually led by a particularly powerful war boss, and one who has proven himself capable of keeping multiple warbands in line through a combination of physical dominance and the occasional well-timed display of extreme violence. Tribes are constantly changing, growing through conquest, shrinking through internal conflict, splitting apart when rival knobs decide they've had enough of the current boss and fancy their chances at starting their own operation. The fluidity of Ork tribal structure means that the social landscape is always shifting, always unstable, always offering opportunities for the ambitious and the cunning. Overlaying this tribal structure is the system of clans, and this is where things get particularly interesting for our hypothetical human. Unlike tribes, which are temporary and geographically defined, Ork clans are permanent, enduring, and possibly genetic in origin. There are 6 major clans, each representing a different aspect of the Ork character, and every Ork belongs to one of them. The Goths are the most aggressive, the hardest fighters. The Orks, who believe that the best way to solve any problem is to hit it until it stops being a problem. The Evil Sons are obsessed with speed, with going faster, with the pure adrenaline rush of hurtling across the landscape in a vehicle that is barely holding together. The Bad Moons are the wealthiest clan, blessed with teeth that grow faster than any other clans, making them the merchant princes of greenskin society, flashy and ostentatious, and always looking for the shiniest new toy. The Death Skulls are the scavengers, the looters, and the superstitious collectors of lucky charms and stolen technology who paint themselves blue because every Ork knows that blue is the luckiest color. The Snakebites are the traditionalists, the Orks who cling to the old ways, who ride squigs and distrust anything more technologically advanced than a sharp stick. And the Blood Axes, as we've already discussed, are the cunning ones, the tacticians, the diplomats, the Orks who have studied human warfare and found things worth stealing in it. A human child growing up in an Ork settlement would inevitably be influenced by the clan culture of the Orks around it, and the specific clan would make a significant difference in the child's development. A child raised among Goths would learn that there is nothing in the universe more important than hitting things, and its education would be oriented entirely toward developing whatever limited combat capability a human body can produce. A child raised among Evil Sons would develop an obsession with vehicles and speed, and might eventually become a surprisingly competent driver or mechanic, putting its human dexterity and fine motor skills to use in ways that the Orks themselves could never match. A child raised among Bad Moons would learn the value of wealth and display, and might develop into a trader or dealmaker of considerable skill, using its human intelligence to navigate the complex economy of teeth and favors that drives greenskin commerce. But it is among the Blood Axes that our hypothetical human would find the most fertile ground for its particular talents. The Blood Axes value cunning above all else. Sure, they prize the ability to think ahead, to plan, to outmaneuver, rather than simply outfight. They are the only Ork clan that has any real understanding of human culture, and they would be the most likely to see the value in a human raised among Orks. A being who could move between two worlds, who could speak two languages, who could understand both the green and the pink perspectives and exploit the gaps between them. Among the Blood Axes, the human child might find something approaching acceptance. Not warmth, not affection, not love, because the Orks have no word for love and no concept of what it means, but a functional place in society, a role that leveraged its unique capabilities, a reason to be kept alive and protected that went beyond mere curiosity or entertainment. The Blood Axes might even give it a proper Orkish name, something guttural and unpronounceable by human standards, but meaningful in the context of greenskin culture. It would be a name that acknowledged both its humanity and its place among the Orks, a name that said, in the crude poetry of the Orkish language, "This one is different, but this one is ours. And with that name, that identity, that place in the world, the human child would begin the next phase of its extraordinary life, the phase where it stops being merely a survivor and starts becoming something that the galaxy has never quite seen before. Something that the Imperium would find horrifying, that the Inquisition would find fascinating, and that the Orks themselves would find, in their own uniquely green-skin way, rather impressive. But before we get to that phase, we need to talk about something that scholars of the 40,000 universe have long debated, something that might be the single most important factor in determining what the Orc-raised human would become. We need to talk about the Gestalt psychic field and what it does to the minds of those who live within it. The Orc psychic Gestalt is one of the most remarkable and least understood phenomena in the entire galaxy. It is the invisible thread that connects every greenskin to every other greenskin, a field of psychic energy generated by the collective unconscious of the Orc species, growing stronger with every additional greenskin in a given area and manifesting in ways that defy the laws of physics as the Imperium understands them. At its most basic level, the Gestalt field is what makes Orc technology work. And this is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Imperial tech priests have studied Orc weapons and vehicles extensively, and their findings are as baffling as they are consistent. Many Orc devices, when examined by qualified Mechanicus adepts, are found to be non-functional. They should not work. The internal components are wrong. The wiring makes no sense. The fuel systems are impossible. The ammunition feeds are blocked by debris. And the entire assembly appears to have been designed by someone whose understanding of engineering comes from a fever dream. And yet, in the hands of an Orc, these devices work perfectly. They fire, they drive, they fly, they kill. The Mechanicus Genitor. Lucas Anzion noted in his studies that many Orc-built weapons will not function at all unless wielded by an Orcoid. And this observation has been confirmed by countless Imperial field reports. When humans attempt to use captured Orc technology, the results range from disappointing to catastrophic. Guns jam, vehicles stall, engines explode. It is as if the machines themselves know that they are in the wrong hands and refuse to cooperate. The explanation, as far as Imperial science has been able to determine, lies in the Gestalt field. The collective psychic energy of the Orc species, channeled unconsciously through every greenskin in the vicinity, acts as a kind of psychic lubricant, a reality-bending force that bridges the gap between what Orc technology is and what the Orcs believe it should be. If enough Orcs believe that a gun will fire, the Gestalt field makes it fire. If enough Orcs believe that red paint makes a vehicle go faster, the Gestalt field makes it go faster. If enough Orcs believe that a particular warboss is invincible, the Gestalt field nudges reality just enough to make him harder to kill. This is not omnipotence. The Gestalt field cannot create something from nothing. It cannot make an Orc fly by sheer force of belief, and it cannot turn a pile of rocks into a functioning starship without at least some rudimentary engineering to give it a framework to work with. But within the parameters of what is physically possible, the Gestalt field can stretch the boundaries of probability in the Orc's favor, making the unlikely likely and the improbable routine. It is, in essence, a galaxy-spanning network of unconscious psychic consensus, and it is one of the primary reasons the Orcs are such a successful species. Now here is the question that matters for our thought experiment. What would this Gestalt field do to a human mind? The answer is not straightforward, because the lore provides no direct examples of a human being fully immersed in the Orc Gestalt from birth. But we can extrapolate from what we know about the field's properties and make some educated guesses about its potential effects on a non-Orc consciousness. The first and most obvious effect would be sensory. A human living among Orcs would be constantly bathed in the Gestalt field, surrounded by the low-level psychic buzz that emanates from every greenskin in the vicinity. For an Orc, this field is imperceptible, as natural and unnoticed as the air they breathe. But a human brain, which is structured differently from an orc brain and which possesses its own latent psychic potential, or might perceive the field as a constant background noise, a pressure against the edges of consciousness that manifests as a subtle but persistent feeling of wrongness. This sensation might fade with time as the human brain adapts to its environment, much as a person living near a busy road eventually stops hearing the traffic. But it would never disappear entirely, and in moments of heightened orc activity, when the Gestalt field surges in response to the collective excitement of battle or the gathering momentum of a great crusade, the human might find itself overwhelmed by sensations it cannot name or control. The second effect would be psychological. The Gestalt field carries within it the emotional signature of the orc species, a wave of aggression, excitement, and raw, unfiltered joy in combat that washes over every orcoid in the area. This emotional contagion is what gives the Great Green Crusades their unstoppable momentum. The reason that orcs fight harder and grow bigger and become more ferocious the more of them there are in one place. A human immersed in this field from birth would inevitably absorb some of this emotional content, developing a baseline level of aggression that is higher than the human norm, a quicker temper, a lower threshold for violence, a tendency to find excitement and even pleasure in physical conflict that most humans would find disturbing. This is not the same as being corrupted by the warp, though the Inquisition would almost certainly make that accusation if they ever encountered such a human. The Gestalt field is distinct from the warp, drawing its power from the collective psyche of the orc species, rather than from the chaotic energies of the Imperium. The Old Ones deliberately blocked the orcs from having any connection to the warp, preventing the taint of chaos from seeping into their creation, and this insulation extends to the Gestalt field itself. A human affected by the orc Gestalt would not be chaos-touched. It would simply be, for lack of a better term, a bit more orky than a normal human, a bit louder, a bit more aggressive, a bit more inclined to solve problems with its fists rather than its words. The third effect, and this is the one that would most profoundly shape the human child's life, would be functional. The Gestalt field, remember, makes things work. It bridges the gap between belief and reality, between intention and outcome. And a human who had grown up within this field, who had spent its entire formative years marinating in the collective psychic energy of the orc species, might find that the field responded to it, at least in limited ways. This would not mean that the human could make orc technology work the way an orc can. The genetic component of the Gestalt field is specific to orcoid biology, and no amount of exposure would change the fundamental architecture of a human brain. But it might mean that the human developed an intuitive understanding of orc technology that no other human possessed, a feel for the crude mechanics that went beyond intellectual understanding and into something approaching instinct. The human might be able to coax performance out of orc weapons that other humans could not. It might be able to drive orc vehicles with a competence that surprised even the mech boys. It might, in short, become the galaxy's foremost expert on orc technology, not through study, but through a lifetime of immersion in the psychic field that makes that technology possible. This skill set would make the human extraordinarily valuable, not only to the orcs who raised it, but to anyone who ever encountered it. Imperial commanders, inquisitors, rogue traders, even the tech priests of the Mechanicus would all have reasons to want a human who understood the orcs from the inside, who could predict their behavior, translate their language, and operate their technology. The human would be, in a very real sense, a walking intelligence asset, a living key to understanding the galaxy's most numerous and most persistent enemy. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. The human is still a child, still growing, still learning. And there is one more aspect of its education that we need to address before we can move forward. One more lesson that the orc settlement would teach it. A lesson that is as old as the orcoid species itself and as fundamental to greenskin culture as the twin gods who preside over it. The lesson of the fight pit. Every orc settlement of any size has a fight pit, a cleared area where disputes are settled, hierarchies are established, and entertainment is provided. The fight pit, is the arena, the courthouse, and the theatre of Orc society, all rolled into one blood-soaked patch of dirt. In the fight pit, grievances are resolved, not through argument or mediation, but through the simple and direct application of violence. 2 orcs enter. On one orc leaves the winner. The loser either leaves on his own power, considerably worse for wear, or is carried out by Gretchen, who are already calculating what they can loot from the body. For the young orcs, the fight pit is also a school. It is where they learn to fight, where they test themselves against opponents of roughly equal size and skill, where they earn their first scars and their first reputations. The orc concept of education is entirely combat-focused, because combat is the only subject that matters in greenskin society. Everything else, cooking, building, driving, healing, is handled by the genetically encoded knowledge that every orc carries in its DNA. But fighting, real fighting, the art of reading an opponent and finding its weakness and exploiting that weakness with maximum efficiency, this must be learned through practice. And the fight pit is where that practice happens. A human child raised among orcs would eventually be thrown into the fight pit, not against a full-grown orc, which would be suicide, but against opponents that orc society considers its peers. Against Gretchen, most likely, or against other young creatures of similar size. And here, in the blood and the dust and the roaring approval of the watching crowd, the child would discover something fundamental about itself and about the nature of combat in orc society. It would discover that it is not the strongest. It would never be the strongest. Even the smallest, youngest orc is considerably stronger than a human child of the same size, with denser muscles, thicker bones, and a natural aggression that gives it an edge in any straightforward contest of strength. The child would lose its first fights, probably badly, and those losses would leave marks, both physical and psychological. But it would also discover something else. It would discover that strength is not the only thing that matters in the fight pit. Speed matters, timing matters, footwork matters, and above all, cunning matters. The child would discover that it could dodge attacks that stronger opponents expected to land, that it could read body language and anticipate strikes before they were thrown, that it could use the terrain of the pit, the uneven ground, the debris, the very walls themselves, to create advantages that raw strength could not overcome. It would discover, in short, that the human gift for tactical thinking, or the same gift that has allowed our species to survive in a galaxy that is actively trying to kill us, applies just as well in a fight pit as it does on a battlefield. And the orcs, watching from the edges of the pit, would notice. They would notice the way the small pink thing moved, the way it slipped away from attacks, the way it used terrain and positioning to compensate for its lack of size. Some of them would laugh, because orcs find cleverness amusing in the same way that humans find a dog walking on its hind legs amusing. But others, particularly the commandos and the blood axes, would watch with something approaching professional interest, recognizing in the child's fighting style a quality that they themselves valued, the quality of being kunin. As the child grew older, as it passed through the threshold of adolescence and into the awkward, gangly, rapidly changing body of a human teenager, its place in orc society would begin to solidify. It would no longer be a curiosity or a novelty. It would be a known quantity, a fixture of the settlement with its own role and its own reputation. The orcs would have a name for it, probably something crude and descriptive, and when they used that name, it would carry a certain weight. Not respect exactly, because orcs reserve respect for things that can beat them in a fight, and no human can beat an orc in a fair fight. But acknowledgement, recognition. The understanding that this particular human, this particular pink thing, had earned its place through years of survival and service. The teenager's role in the settlement would depend heavily on its specific skills and the needs of the tribe. If it had demonstrated an aptitude for mechanics, it might find itself working alongside the mech boys, using its human hands and human eyes to perform tasks that require a level of precision that orc fingers, however skilled, struggle to achieve. The mech boys would value this contribution highly because their work, the endless building and rebuilding and modification of the vehicles and weapons that Orc society depends on, is always limited by the crudeness of their own anatomy. A human with steady hands and a good eye for detail could make the difference between a vehicle that works and a vehicle that works well. And in Orc society, yes, the distinction between working and working well is often the distinction between victory and defeat. If the teenager had demonstrated a talent for social manipulation, it might become a kind of unofficial diplomat, a go-between who smoothed the rough edges of interclan relations and helped resolve disputes before they escalated into full-scale tribal warfare. This role would be particularly valuable in a settlement that contained orcs from multiple clans, as the teenager's human perspective, its ability to see both sides of a disagreement and find compromise solutions that satisfied both parties, would be a unique asset in a culture that typically resolves disputes through violence alone. If the teenager had developed combat skills, it might earn a place in one of the warband's fighting units, probably among the commandos or the storm boys, where its human stealth and agility would be most useful. A human commando, trained from childhood in the art of sneaking and ambush, would be an absolutely terrifying opponent, capable of moving through environments that would reveal a full-sized orc, of squeezing through gaps that no greenskin could pass, of blending into human populations in ways that a 7-foot-tall green-skinned fungoid could never manage. The Blood Axes, in particular, would see enormous potential in such a fighter, and might go to considerable lengths to develop and protect this asset. But whatever specific role the teenager occupied, one thing would remain constant. It would always be different. It would always be other. It would walk through the settlement as a being caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, understood completely by no one. The Orcs would never see it as an equal, because to an Orc, equality is determined by size and strength, and a human will never match a greenskin on those terms. The Gretchen would view it with a mixture of comradeship and suspicion, accepting it as a fellow runt, but always aware that it was fundamentally different from them in ways they could not articulate. And the human itself, growing through the turbulent years of adolescence with no human guidance, no human role models, no mirror in which to see its own face reflected in a form that made sense, would struggle with questions of identity that no creature in the galaxy had ever been forced to confront. Who am I? The question would haunt the teenager in quiet moments, in the rare spaces between the violence and the noise, that when the settlement fell into something approaching calm, and the mind had room to think. Am I Orc? The answer, obviously, was no. The teenager's pink skin, its lack of tusks, its relative smallness, its strange flat teeth, and its unforgivable fragility marked it as alien to greenskin kind in every physical sense. Am I human? This question was harder to answer because the teenager had no memory of human society, no experience of human customs, no understanding of what it meant to be human in any cultural sense. It knew the word human only as the Orcs used it, as a synonym for prey, for livestock, for the soft pink things that screamed satisfyingly when you hit them. To be human, in the teenager's understanding, was to be weak, to be conquered, to be enslaved. And the teenager, who had spent its entire life proving that it was none of those things, would recoil from that identification with every fiber of its being. This identity crisis, this fundamental dislocation of self, is perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the Orc-raised human's experience. Human beings are social creatures who define themselves through their relationships with others, and the Orc-raised human would have no relationships that reflected its own nature back to it in a recognizable form. It would be, in the most literal possible sense, alone in the universe, a category of one, a species without a culture, a mind without a mirror. And yet, there is a precedent. There is a historical example of humans who crossed the boundary between human and greenskin culture and found a way to exist on the other side. Well, they are called the Diggers, and their story is one of the strangest and most illuminating chapters in the long, bloody history of Orc-human relations. The Diggers, or Digganobs as their leaders are known, originated on the world of Angelis, a barren desert planet on the far edges of the Ultima Segmentum that gained its more famous name, Gorkamorka, after an Orc-inhabited space hulk crashed into it in the mid-35th millennium. At the time of the crash, an Imperial survey vessel called the Eternal Vigilance was in orbit, and an Adeptus Mechanicus team was on the surface investigating mysterious pyramid structures, which were later revealed to be of Necron origin. The catastrophic impact of the space hulk separated the human survivors into two groups. Those who had been near the Imperial outpost on the surface were mutated by the radiation from the crash, becoming the twisted and pitiful creatures known as muties. But those who had been inside the pyramid structures, deep underground and shielded from the worst of the radiation, survived relatively intact. Cut off from the Imperium, with no means of communication and no hope of rescue, these humans did the only thing they could do. They adapted. They survived. And over the generations, with no contact with their Imperial heritage and constant exposure to the Orc culture that now dominated their world, they began to change. They became the Diggers. The Diggers are, in essence, humans who have gone native in Orc territory. They have adopted Orc language, Orc customs, Orc values, and even a crude imitation of Orc technology. As they organize themselves in warbands led by Digganobs, larger and more physically imposing individuals who are the human equivalent of Orc nobs. They fight with Orcish weapons, drive Orcish vehicles, and worship Gork and Mork with the same fervor as any greenskin. They have even developed a class of spiritual leaders called Digger Shamans, who claim to receive visions and prophecies in a manner not unlike the Orc weirdboys. The Orcs of Gorkamorka regard the Diggers with a mixture of contempt and grudging tolerance. They are too small and too weak to be considered proper Orcs, but they fight with enough enthusiasm and adopt enough Orcish customs to be considered at least marginally acceptable. The Diggers are permitted to exist on the margins of Orc society, us participating in the endless scrap-gathering competitions that drive the planet's economy, trading with Orc settlements, and occasionally fighting alongside Orc warbands when the circumstances align. The existence of the Diggers proves something fundamental about the relationship between humans and Orcs. It proves that it is possible, under the right conditions, for humans to be absorbed into Orc culture, not as slaves, not as livestock, but as participants, however marginal, in the green-skin way of life. The Diggers have not been Orcified in any biological sense. They are still human, still pink-skinned and relatively fragile, but they have been culturally transformed, their human identity overwritten by generations of exposure to Orc values and Orc customs, until the original human culture has been completely forgotten. Well, and this is what makes the Diggers so relevant to our thought experiment. Because if an entire community of humans can undergo this transformation over the course of generations, imagine what would happen to a single human child raised from infancy, not alongside the Orcs, but among them, not on the margins of greenskin society, but inside it, absorbing the culture, not as an adult adapting to new circumstances, but as a child forming its fundamental understanding of the world. Our hypothetical human would be, in essence, a Digger taken to its logical extreme. A human so deeply immersed in Orc culture that the cultural transformation is not a gradual, generational process, but a single-generation event, compressed into the formative years of a single life. The child would not be a human who has adopted Orc customs. It would be a human who has never known anything else, for whom Orc customs are not a foreign culture to be learned, but the natural and only way of being in the world. The lore of the Diggers also tells us something about how the broader galaxy responds to such humans, and the answer is not encouraging. The Imperium has no place for humans who have been culturally assimilated by Xenos. The official position of the ecclesiarchy is that the human soul belongs to the emperor, and any deviation from imperial culture, any adoption of alien beliefs or customs, is a form of spiritual corruption that must be purged. The Inquisition, specifically the Ordo Xenos, whose mandate is the defense of humanity against alien threats, would regard an orc-raised human not as a victim to be rescued, but as a heretic to be destroyed. The very existence of such a person would be considered an insult to the Emperor's vision for humanity, a living proof that the great work of the Imperial Creed can be undone, that humans can be made into something other than what the Emperor intended them to be. This means that if the orc-raised human ever encountered the Imperium, the result would almost certainly be catastrophic. Best case scenario, the human is captured, imprisoned, and subjected to extensive interrogation by inquisitorial agents who would mine every scrap of intelligence they could from a being that understands orc society from the inside. Worst case scenario, and the more likely one, the human is simply executed as a Xenos sympathizer, its potential value as an intelligence asset outweighed by the threat it represents to the purity of human culture. But we are moving too fast. The human is still growing, still living among the orcs, still navigating the daily challenges of a life that no imperial scholar could have predicted and no human psychologist could have prepared for. Let us return to the settlement and watch as our human enters adulthood, as it grows into its full capabilities and begins to understand, with the clarity that only maturity can bring, exactly what it is and what it can never be. The transition from adolescence to adulthood in orc society is not marked by any formal ceremony or rite of passage. There is no coming-of-age ritual, no celebration of maturity, no symbolic moment when a young orc is recognized as a full member of the community. In orc society, you are an adult when you are big enough to take what you want and tough enough to keep it. The transition is organic, gradual, and often violent, as young orcs challenge older ones for status and resources, slowly climbing the hierarchy through the accumulation of victories and scars. For the human, adulthood would arrive differently. There would be no dramatic growth spurt, no sudden increase in size and strength that announced its readiness for a more prominent role. Instead, the transition would be marked by a gradual expansion of the human's sphere of influence, a slow accumulation of skills, relationships, and reputation that made it an increasingly important part of the settlement's ecosystem. By the time the human reached its late teens or early 20s, it would have developed a set of skills that was genuinely unique in the 41st millennium. It would speak Orcish with native fluency, not the broken, only approximated Orcish that Blood Axe's commandos occasionally pick up from human prisoners. But the real thing, with all its nuances and dialects and the guttural intensity that makes Orc speech so distinctive, it would also retain the ability to speak Low Gothic, the common tongue of the Imperium, though this skill would be rusty from disuse and coloured by a heavy Orcish accent that would make Imperial listeners do a double take. It would understand Orc technology at an instinctive level, having grown up watching mechboys work and occasionally assisting them in ways that made use of its human dexterity. It would know how to maintain, repair, and even modify the crude but effective weapons and vehicles that the Orcs relied on, and its understanding of the principles behind this technology, it gleaned from a lifetime of immersion in the Gestalt field, would be deeper and more intuitive than anything the Mechanicus could achieve through mere study. It would know Orc combat tactics, having observed and participated in hundreds of fights, from the small-scale scuffles of the Gretchen Warrens to the full-scale battles that erupted when rival warbands clashed. Its fighting style would be a unique hybrid, combining the brutal directness of Orc combat with the evasive cunning of a human who has spent its entire life being smaller and weaker than everything around it. It would fight like a mongoose among snakes, quick and precise and ruthlessly efficient, exploiting weaknesses that larger opponents did not know they had. And it would know the culture, the stories, the songs, the myths, the superstitions, of the complex web of clan rivalries and tribal alliances that defined greenskin politics. It would know which war boss was ascendant and which was declining. It would know the signs that preceded a great green crusade, the gathering momentum, the increasing frequency of fights, the restless energy that built and built until it exploded outward in a wave of green-skin destruction that could swallow worlds. It would understand the Orks not as the Imperium understood them, as a faceless horde of barbaric Xenos, but as individuals with their own personalities, their own ambitions, their own quirks and foibles and weaknesses. This knowledge, this deep and intimate understanding of the galaxy's most numerous alien species, would make the human one of the most valuable intelligence assets in existence. If anyone on the Imperial side ever had the wisdom to recognize it. But that recognition, if it ever came, would come too late and in the wrong form, because by the time the Imperium became aware of the human's existence, it would already be too late to separate the human from the Ork. The cultural transformation would be complete, the identity fully formed, the allegiance, such as it was, firmly established. And here we arrive at the central tragedy of the Ork-raised human's existence. It is a being that belongs nowhere. Among the Orks, it will always be the runt, the oddity, the pink thing that fights well, but will never be big enough, green enough, or tough enough to be considered a true greenskin. Among humans, it would be a monster, a traitor, a creature so thoroughly contaminated by alien influence that it could never be trusted, and never be accepted, never be redeemed. This is the horror that lies at the heart of our thought experiment. Not the physical danger, not the violence, not the deprivation, but the existential loneliness of being a species of one. The Ork-raised human would know, with the unflinching clarity of lived experience, that it does not fit, that it will never fit, that the universe has no place for what it is, and that every community it encounters, whether green or pink, will see it as an outsider, an aberration, a thing that should not exist. And yet it does exist. It breathes, it thinks, it fights, it survives. It carries within it the combined knowledge of two cultures that have been at war for thousands of years, a knowledge that could bridge the gap between species or drive them further apart, depending on how it is used. It is, and in its own way, a monument to the resilience of the human spirit, the astonishing adaptability that has allowed our species to survive in the most hostile environments imaginable. It is proof that a human being, stripped of everything that typically defines humanity, culture, language, religion, community, can still find a way to endure, to grow, to become something that the universe never intended. Now let us consider how this extraordinary individual would navigate the specific challenges of adult life in an Ork settlement, and what role it would ultimately carve out for itself in a society that has no template for what it is. The most immediately relevant challenge would be combat. In Ork society, combat is not optional. It is the central activity around which all of greenskin life revolves, the axis upon which the entire culture turns. An Ork who cannot fight, or who refuses to fight, is not merely useless, but incomprehensible. A contradiction in terms, like a fish that refuses to swim, or a fire that refuses to burn. And while the Ork-raised human would never be expected to fight like an Ork, it would absolutely be expected to fight. The question is how. A full-grown human, even one raised in the harsh conditions of an Ork settlement, would be significantly smaller and weaker than even the least impressive Ork boy. In a straight-up brawl, the human would lose every time, and losing in Ork society has consequences that range from painful to fatal. The human would need to fight smart, to use its unique capabilities in ways that compensated for its physical limitations, and to find a niche in the Ork military apparatus that valued what it could do rather than what it could not. The most natural fit would be as a scout or infiltrator, a role that plays to the human's strengths in stealth, observation, and enemy analysis. Ork scouts, known as commandos, are already the closest thing greenskin society has to special operations troops, using stealth and ambush tactics that other Orks consider sneaky and unsporting, but effective nonetheless. A human commando would be even better at this role than an Ork commando, for the simple reason that a human is smaller, quieter, and far less conspicuous than a 7-foot-tall, green-skinned fungoid. The human could move through terrain that would reveal an orc. It could hide in spaces that an orc could never fit into. And it could observe enemy positions for hours without the restless fidgeting that gives away an orc scout. And most importantly, if the enemy was human, the orc-raised human could walk among them undetected, gathering intelligence that no greenskin could ever hope to obtain. This would make the human indispensable during campaigns against Imperial forces, and campaigns against Imperial forces are the bread and butter of orc warfare. Humans are, as the lore notes, the orc's favorite enemy, and the majority of major orc campaigns are directed against Imperial worlds. An orc warband that possessed a human scout who could infiltrate Imperial positions, read Imperial signage, listen to Imperial communications, and report back on Imperial defenses would have an enormous tactical advantage, and one that could make the difference between a successful planetary invasion and a costly stalemate. The Blood Axes, with their existing appreciation for human-style tactics, would be the most likely clan to fully exploit this capability. A Blood Axes war boss who had the wisdom to recognize the human's value, and orc war bosses are considerably smarter than the Imperium gives them credit for, might elevate the human to a position of genuine authority within the warband's intelligence-gathering apparatus. The human would not be a nob, because nob status requires physical dominance, but it might hold an informal rank, a position of trust and responsibility that was recognized by the warband's leadership, even if it had no formal name in the orc hierarchy. This position would bring both benefits and dangers. The benefits are obvious: protection, resources, status, a degree of autonomy that few non-orcs in the galaxy ever enjoy. The dangers are equally obvious: jealousy from orcs who resent the human's influence, hostility from other clans who view the Blood Axe's use of a human asset as further proof of their treacherous, un-orky ways, and the constant risk of being killed in the line of duty by enemies who do not share the warband's appreciation for its unique capabilities. But the deepest danger would be internal. It would be the danger of success. Because the more useful the human became, the more deeply it would be integrated into orc society, and the more deeply it was integrated, the harder it would be to ever leave. Every successful mission, every piece of intelligence delivered, yet every tactical advantage provided would bind the human more tightly to the warband that raised it, creating a web of obligation and identity that would become, in time, unbreakable. And this raises the question that haunts the entire thought experiment, the question that the human itself would eventually be forced to confront, probably in the most dramatic and painful way imaginable. Where do its loyalties lie? With the orcs who raised it, crude and brutal as they are, the only family it has ever known, or with humanity, the species it belongs to by birth but has never known, the species that would reject it if it ever tried to return? The answer, for most of the human's life, would be simple. It would be loyal to the orcs, because loyalty, in the human sense of the word, is a product of relationship. And the human's only relationships are with greenskins, the war boss who protects it, the mech boy who taught it to weld, the Gretchen who shared their fungus beer with it on cold nights. These are the beings who populate the human's emotional landscape, and it would fight for them and risk its life for them with the same fierce dedication that any human shows toward the people it calls its own. But there would be moments. There would be moments when the human, in the quiet hours between battles, would catch a glimpse of something that stirred a feeling it could not name. The sight of a human prisoner being dragged through the camp in chains, eyes wide with terror, and something in the prisoner's face, some quality of expression, some flicker of emotion that no orc face had ever shown, would touch something deep in the human's consciousness, in something that all the years of orc upbringing could not quite erase. The human might not understand what it was feeling in that moment. It might interpret the feeling as weakness, as a flaw in its own character that needed to be suppressed. It might push the feeling down bury it beneath layers of greenskin bravado and aggressive posturing. But it would not go away. It would linger, like a half-remembered dream, resurfacing at unexpected moments, reminding the human that beneath the orcish exterior, beneath the language and the customs and the cultural conditioning, there was something else, something older, something that belonged to a different world entirely. This internal conflict would define the human's adult life, creating a tension that could never be fully resolved. It would be the source of its greatest strength, at the human empathy and emotional depth that gave it insights into both species that no one else possessed. And it would be the source of its greatest vulnerability, the crack in the armor that could, if exploited by the right adversary, bring the entire edifice of its carefully constructed identity crashing down. Let us now consider the broader implications of the orc-raised human's existence, the ripple effects that would spread outward from this single, extraordinary life into the wider galaxy. The first and most immediate implication concerns the orcs themselves. The presence of a human in their midst, a human who speaks their language and shares their customs, but who is physically and mentally different from them in fundamental ways. Maz would force the orcs to confront questions about the nature of their own identity that they have never had reason to consider before. What does it mean to be an orc? Is it a matter of biology, of being green-skinned and tough and born from spores? Or is it a matter of culture, of speaking the language and worshipping the gods and loving the fight? If a human can do all of those things, can fight alongside orcs and contribute to the warband, and even earn a grudging measure of respect from the boys, does that make it an orc in some meaningful sense? These are not questions that most orcs would think to ask, because most orcs do not think about anything more complicated than what they're going to hit next. But the more thoughtful orcs are the ones who belong to the Blood Axes, or who hold positions of leadership that require a degree of strategic thinking, might find themselves grappling with these questions in ways that surprise even them. And the answers they arrive at, or fail to arrive at, might have implications for how the orcs interact with humans in the future, not just on this one world, but across the galaxy. The second implication concerns the Imperium. If word ever reached Imperial authorities that a human was living among orcs, not as a slave, but as an integrated member of an orc warband, the reaction would be explosive. The Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition would mobilize immediately, dispatching agents to investigate, to confirm the reports, and to neutralize the threat. Because make no mistake, the Imperium would see the orc-raised human as a threat, and not because of anything the human had done, but because of what it represented. A human who had willingly, or at least non-resistingly, adopted alien culture was a walking repudiation of everything the Imperial Creed stood for, a living proof that the bonds of human civilization could be broken, that the light of the Emperor's truth could be dimmed by the crude darkness of Xenos influence. The Inquisition would want the human dead, both to eliminate the security risk posed by a human who knew orc tactics from the inside, and to prevent the spread of the dangerous idea that humans could live among aliens and not only survive, but thrive. In the paranoid, zero-sum world of imperial politics, the mere existence of the orc-raised human would be treated as an act of aggression against the human species, and a violation of the genetic and spiritual purity that the Imperium prizes above almost everything else. But there would be dissenters, even within the Inquisition. Certain inquisitors, particularly the more radical members of the Ordo Xenos, might see the human not as a threat, but as an opportunity. A human who understood orc society from the inside, who could predict orc behavior and translate orc communications and even operate orc technology, would be an intelligence asset of incalculable value. The information that such a human could provide about orc military organization, about the Gestalt field, about the psychological vulnerabilities of specific war bosses, could save billions of imperial lives in future conflicts. The tension between the Puritans who wanted the human destroyed and the radicals who wanted it preserved would create a political drama worthy of the Inquisition's finest hour, a struggle between principle and pragmatism that would play out in secret chambers and coded communiques across the segmentum. The outcome of this struggle would depend on the specific circumstances, the personalities involved, the political winds of the moment, and the ever-shifting balance of power within the Inquisition's Byzantine hierarchy. But whatever the outcome, the orc-raised human would be at the center of it, a pawn in a game it did not understand, played by forces it had never known existed. The third implication concerns the broader question of what it means to be human in the 41st millennium. The Imperium defines humanity in very specific terms. Ye as a species created by the Emperor to rule the galaxy, bound together by shared genetics, shared culture, and shared faith in the divine nature of the Master of mankind. Anything that falls outside this definition, any deviation from the template of what a human should be, is treated as a corruption, a heresy, a threat to the species' survival. But the orc-raised human challenges this definition at its most fundamental level. It is human in every biological sense. Its DNA is human. Its body is human. Its brain, with all its human capacity for thought, emotion, and creativity, is human. But its culture is alien. Its values are alien. Its understanding of the universe is alien. It is, in the most literal possible sense, a human being who does not belong to humanity. While a member of the species who has been raised outside the species' cultural framework and who has developed an identity that the species does not recognize as its own. This raises questions that the Imperium would rather not face. Questions about the nature of identity, about the relationship between biology and culture, about whether humanity is something you are born with or something you are taught. These are dangerous questions in the 40,000 universe, questions that the ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition have worked very hard to suppress, because the answers, whatever they might be, would threaten the foundations of imperial ideology. And yet the questions persist, because the orc-raised human persists, because it exists, because it breathes and thinks and fights and refuses to die, because the human spirit, for all its fragility, for all its capacity for corruption and compromise, is ultimately a stubborn and irrepressible thing that will not be denied. Let us now turn to what might be the most fascinating aspect of this entire thought experiment, the question of what the orc-raised human would think about itself. Not what the orcs think about it, not what the Imperium would think about it, but what it, sitting alone in the darkness of an orc camp with only its own thoughts for company, would think about the strange and impossible life it has been given. The human would know from a very early age that it was different. The evidence would be inescapable, written in the color of its skin, the shape of its face, the sound of its voice, the way it moved through a world that was built for beings 3 times its size. It would know that it was not an orc. And this knowledge would be both liberating and agonizing, because it meant that the human was free from some of the constraints of orc society, but forever excluded from its full rewards. An orc knows exactly what it is. An orc knows its place in the hierarchy, its role in the warband, its clan, its gods, its purpose. An orc has no existential crises, no identity confusion, no midnight dark night of the soul where it lies awake, wondering what it all means. The orc psyche is a remarkably uncomplicated thing, designed by the Old Ones to produce a creature that is supremely well adapted to its role as a warrior. And part of that adaptation is a complete absence of the kind of introspective anxiety that plagues the human mind. The orc-raised human would have no such peace. It would carry within it the full weight of human consciousness, while the capacity for self-reflection, for doubt, for existential dread, and it would have no framework for processing these feelings. It would know that it was troubled, but it would not know why. It would feel a hollowness at the center of its being, a sense of incompleteness that no amount of fighting or feasting or camaraderie could fill. And it would not have the words, in either Orcish or the rusty low Gothic that still lingered in the corners of its mind, to describe what it was experiencing. This is the human condition in its most distilled and most painful form, the capacity for suffering that comes with the capacity for thought. the price we pay for being able to ask, why, in a universe that offers no answers. The orc-raised human would pay this price in full, and it would pay it alone, might without the comfort of a human community to share the burden or a human tradition to provide the context. And yet, there is something beautiful in this suffering, something that speaks to the deepest truths of the human experience. Because the very fact that the human can suffer, can feel the ache of loneliness and the burn of unanswered questions, proves that it is still, fundamentally, human. The orcs, for all their influence, for all their cultural conditioning, have not been able to erase the essential humanity of the child they raised. They have overlaid it with a veneer of greenskin customs and values. They have shaped its behavior and its language and its habits, but they have not been able to touch the core, the irreducible kernel of human consciousness that remains, unchanged and unchangeable, cast beneath all the layers of orcish culture. This is the quiet triumph of the orc-raised human story. Not that it survived, though survival in an orc settlement is no small achievement. Not that it found a place in a society that had no place for it, though that too is remarkable, but that it remained human, that despite everything, despite the violence and the deprivation and the total absence of human contact, the spark of human consciousness continued to burn, continued to question, continued to seek meaning in a universe that seemed determined to deny it. And perhaps, in the end, that is the answer to the question we started with. What would happen if orcs raised a human child? The answer is not a single thing. It is not a simple outcome. It is a process, a journey, a life lived at the intersection of two incompatible worlds, as shaped by forces that the child neither chose nor understood. The answer is a person, a unique and unprecedented individual, whose very existence challenges everything both species believe about themselves and about each other. The orc-raised human would be feared by the Imperium, tolerated by the orcs, understood by no one, and utterly alone in a galaxy of trillions. It would carry within it the knowledge of two civilizations and the belonging of neither. It would fight with the cunning of a human and the ferocity of a greenskin, speak the language of the orcs with the emotional depth of a human mind, and pray to gods that were not its gods in a faith that was not its faith. It would be a walking contradiction, a living impossibility, a creature that should not exist but does, stubbornly and irrefutably, and in defiance of everything the universe has tried to do to stamp it out. Now there is another dimension to this thought experiment that we have not yet fully explored, and it concerns the physical development of the human body under conditions that were never designed for it. Because the orc-raised human's body would tell a story of its own, a story written in scar tissue and calloused hands, and a posture shaped by years of living in a world built for beings half again its height. The body would be a map of the life it had lived, and reading that map would reveal things about the human's experience that no amount of conversation could convey. The human would be, by normal imperial standards, remarkably tough. Not orc tough, not even close, but tough in the way that humans who grow up in extreme environments are tough, but with a tolerance for pain and discomfort that would make a hardened Cadian guardsman pause. Years of eating a diet that was nutritionally inadequate, but supplemented by whatever the human's growing body could extract from orcoid foodstuffs, would produce a lean, wiry physique, lacking the bulk of a well-fed imperial citizen, but packed with the kind of functional strength that comes from a lifetime of physical labor and constant survival challenges. The human skin would be marked with scars, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, the accumulated evidence of fights won and lost, of encounters with aggressive wildlife, of accidents in workshops and kitchens, of the simple reality that living among orcs means living in a world where sharp objects are everywhere and safety regulations are non-existent. Some of these scars would be orcish in origin, the distinctive marks left by crude blades and blunt instruments. Others might bear the telltale signs of pain-boy intervention, suggesting that at some point in its life, the human had been injured badly enough to require the attention of an orc doctor. an experience that in itself would be worthy of its own horror story. The Pain Boy's interest in the human is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it opens up a particularly disturbing avenue of speculation. Pain Boys, remember, are driven by an insatiable curiosity about biology. They are the Ork equivalent of scientists. If you replace the scientific method with a chainsaw and the peer review process with a series of increasingly alarming screaming sounds. A Pain Boy who had access to a human, particularly a human who was a member of the settlement, and therefore not simply disposable test material, would find the temptation to experiment almost impossible to resist. The experiments would start small, a blood sample here, a tissue sample there, the Pain Boy poking and prodding the human's body with the same fascinated intensity that a child shows toward a particularly interesting insect. But over time, as the Pain Boy's curiosity grew and its understanding of human anatomy deepened, the experiments might become more invasive. The Pain Boy might attempt to enhance the human's body using the same crude cybernetic techniques that it applies to Ork patients, grafting Orkoid bionics onto human flesh, replacing damaged organs with crude mechanical substitutes, pushing the boundaries of what a human body can tolerate in the name of what passes for science in Ork society. The results of these modifications would be unpredictable at best. Ork bionics are designed for Ork physiology, which is considerably more resilient and more forgiving than human physiology. A cybernetic arm that works perfectly on an Ork might cause chronic pain, infection, or rejection in a human host. A mechanical eye that gives an Ork-enhanced vision might cause constant headaches and visual disturbances in a human brain. The Pain Boy, whose knowledge of human anatomy would be entirely self-taught and based on a sample size of 1, would be working without a safety net, and the human would be the one paying the price for every mistake. And yet, some of these modifications might actually work. Human-Ork hybrid bionics are optimized through years of painful trial and error, might eventually produce results that neither species could achieve alone. A human hand enhanced with Orkoid mechanical components might be stronger and more durable than either a normal human hand or a standard Ork bionic. A human eye augmented with Orkoid optical technology might provide a range of vision that exceeded both human and Ork norms. The human, through the accumulated modifications of a lifetime, might become something that was, in a purely physical sense, more than human, a cybernetic hybrid that blurred the line between organic and mechanical in ways that would fascinate the mechanicus and horrify the ecclesiarchy in equal measure. This physical transformation would complement the cultural transformation that we have already discussed, creating a being that was visibly, unmistakably different from any normal human. The Ork-raised human, in its adult form, would be a striking and disturbing figure, lean and scarred and partially mechanical, moving with a predatory grace that combined human agility with the aggressive confidence of a creature raised among the galaxy's most violent species. It would wear Orkish clothing and Orkish armor, decorated with the trophies and totems of its warband, and it would carry Orkish weapons that it could use with a proficiency that no other human in the galaxy could match. If you saw this person walking toward you across a battlefield, you would not know what you were looking at. You would not know if it was human or alien, friend or foe, savior or executioner. You would know only that it was something you had never encountered before, or something that existed outside the categories your mind had been trained to recognize, something that the galaxy had never intended to produce, but had produced anyway, in the blind, random, endlessly creative way that the galaxy does everything. And you would be afraid. You would be afraid because the unknown is always frightening, because the thing that defies classification is the thing that is hardest to defend against. And because in the grim darkness of the far future, the things you don't understand are the things most likely to kill you. But you might also be fascinated, because there is something compelling about the Ork-raised human, something that draws the eye and captures the imagination. It is the fascination of the impossible made real. The attraction of a life lived so far outside the bounds of normal experience that it becomes a kind of art, a kind of poetry, a kind of story that is worth telling, even if, perhaps especially if, it ends badly. And now we must consider how it might end. Because all stories end, even the strangest ones, and the story of the orc-raised human is no exception. There are several possible endings, each with its own flavor of tragedy. Because in the 41st millennium, tragedy is the default setting, and happy endings are a luxury that the universe cannot afford. The first ending is the simplest and the most common. The human dies in battle, fighting alongside the orcs who raised it, cut down by the weapons of an enemy that never knew what it was killing. In this ending, the human's body is left on the field alongside the green-skinned corpses of its warband, and whatever Imperial forces eventually secure the battlefield find it among the dead and catalogue it as an anomaly, a curiosity, a footnote in a report that no one will ever read. The human's life, with all its complexity and contradiction, is reduced to a single line in a casualty assessment. One human body recovered among orc casualties, cause of death, multiple weapons injuries, disposition, standard cremation. The story ends, not with a bang, but with the quiet indifference of an empire that processes millions of deaths every day and cannot be bothered to wonder about the circumstances of any individual one. The second ending is more dramatic. The human is captured by Imperial forces, identified as a Xenos collaborator, and brought before the Inquisition for interrogation. In this scenario, the Inquisitors would extract everything the human knows about Orc society, Orc technology, and Orc military organization, using methods that range from the sophisticated to the brutal. The human, unable to communicate its own story in a way that the Inquisitors would understand or accept, would be regarded as a traitor to its species, a creature whose cultural corruption was so profound that redemption was impossible. After the interrogation was complete and the intelligence extracted, the human would be quietly executed, its body burned, its name erased from the record. The Inquisition would never acknowledge that such a person had existed, because to acknowledge it would be to acknowledge that humans could be lost to alien influence, and then that acknowledgement would undermine the very foundations of Imperial ideology. The third ending, the rarest and the most bittersweet, involves the human choosing to leave. Perhaps it encounters a group of humans during a raid, slaves being transported from one orc settlement to another, and something in their faces, something in the way they look at each other, something in the bonds of affection and loyalty that even slavery cannot destroy, awakens the dormant humanity that the human has carried within it all its life. Perhaps it makes a choice, the most difficult choice it has ever made, to leave behind everything it knows, everyone it has ever cared about, and walk into the unknown, hoping to find among its own species the sense of belonging that it has never found among the orcs. This ending would be the beginning of a new story, one that is equally painful and equally compelling. The human, returning to human society after a lifetime among aliens, would face challenges that make its orc upbringing look easy by comparison. It would have to learn human customs from scratch, navigating a culture that it intellectually belongs to but has never experienced. It would have to earn the trust of people who would instinctively fear and distrust it, overcoming the deep-seated xenophobia that Imperial culture breeds into every citizen from birth. It would have to come to terms with its own identity, reconciling the orc-raised warrior it has been with the human being it is discovering it has always been. And it would have to do all of this while carrying the knowledge that somewhere out there, in the vast green horde that is sweeping across the galaxy, the orcs who raised it are still fighting, still laughing, still dying, still doing the only thing they know how to do. And it would miss them, despite everything, despite the violence and the cruelty and the total absence of anything resembling human warmth. It would miss them because they were its family, the only family it ever had, and the heart, the stubborn, inconvenient, impossibly resilient human heart, does not stop loving simply because the object of its love is monstrous. This is the ultimate irony of the orc-raised human story. The orcs, who have no concept of love, who find the entire idea of human affection baffling and ridiculous, have managed to inspire it in the one human who knows them best. Not because they tried, not because they wanted to, but simply because they were there. And because they were the world the human was born into. Because in the absence of any other option, the human heart attached itself to whatever was available and called it home. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, that might be the most human thing of all. Now, there is a particular element of this thought experiment that we have touched on but not fully explored, and it concerns the way different orc clans would shape the human's development in dramatically different ways. We talked about the blood axes and their pragmatic appreciation for human cunning, but the reality is that each of the 6 major clans would produce a fundamentally different version of the orc-raised human, each with its own skills, its own perspective, and its own particular brand of tragedy. Among the Goths, the most brutal and combat-focused of all the orc clans, the human would be raised in an environment where physical prowess is the only currency that matters. The Goths have no time for clever tricks or sneaky tactics. They believe in the purity of close combat, in the simple beauty of a fist connecting with a face, in the uncomplicated joy of wading into the enemy and hitting everything within reach until nothing is left standing. A human raised among Goths would internalize this philosophy completely, developing a fighting style that maximized its limited physical capabilities through sheer aggression and reckless courage. It would learn to close distance quickly, to get inside the reach of larger opponents, apt to strike at vulnerable points with the concentrated fury of a being that knows it cannot afford a prolonged exchange. It would be small and fast and terrifyingly determined, a whirlwind of human rage wrapped in Goth black, and the other orcs, watching it fight, would feel something that, for a Goth, was the highest possible praise, an enthusiastic nod and a grunt that translated roughly as, "Dat one's got spirit." The evil sons would produce something entirely different. The evil sons are obsessed with speed, with the sensation of hurtling through space at velocities that turn the landscape into a blur and the air into a screaming wall of pressure. They are the hot rodders of orc society, the speed addicts, the beings for whom the distance between fast enough and too fast is a distinction that has no meaning. A human raised among evil sons would be a driver, a pilot, a creature of machines and motion whose entire identity was bound up in the art of going fast. The human's smaller size and lighter weight would actually be an advantage in this context, allowing it to squeeze into cockpits and driver's seats that larger orcs found cramped, and its human capacity for fine motor control would make it a surprisingly competent pilot, capable of executing maneuvers that required a level of precision that orc reflexes, however quick, could not quite match. The evil son's human would live for the race, for the chase, for the moment when the throttle hit maximum and the world dissolved into speed and noise, and the pure, crystalline joy of going faster than anything had any right to go. The Bad Moons, the wealthiest and flashiest of the orc clans, it would produce a merchant, a trader, a hustler. The Bad Moons are the capitalists of orc society, the ones whose teeth grow faster than anyone else's, making them the default bankers and shopkeepers of the greenskin economy. Among the Bad Moons, wealth is displayed ostentatiously, with the richest orcs wearing the shiniest armor, wielding the most elaborately decorated weapons, and surrounding themselves with the most impressive collection of trophies and baubles that teeth can buy. A human raised in this environment would develop an acute sense of value, an understanding of what things are worth and how to acquire them at the lowest possible cost. The human's ability to count, to plan ahead, to think in terms of long-term investment and deferred gratification, skills that come naturally to human brains, but that are almost completely absent in orc psychology, would make it a natural trader, a being who could accumulate wealth with an efficiency that even the most successful bad moon would find impressive. The bad moon's human would be rich, by Orc standards, and its wealth would buy it a degree of protection and influence that its physical stature could never provide. The Death Skulls, the scavengers and looters, would produce something stranger still. The Death Skulls are the superstitious ones, the Orcs who paint themselves blue because blue is lucky, who collect charms and trinkets and talismans with the obsessive fervor of a being that genuinely believes the universe can be propitiated with the right combination of stolen objects. They are also the most persistent thieves in Orc society, are famous for their ability to appropriate anything that is not nailed down and a few things that are. A human raised among Death Skulls would develop a magpie's eye for valuable objects, an ability to spot useful technology in piles of junk that would make an Adeptus Mechanicus explorator weep with envy. The human would also absorb the Death Skull's superstitious worldview, developing a complex and deeply personal belief system that combined Orc folk religion with the kind of magical thinking that is common in cultures that lack a scientific framework for understanding the world. The Death Skull's human would paint its skin blue, wear lucky charms around its neck, and genuinely believe that certain objects, certain colors, certain rituals had the power to influence fate. And in the 41st millennium, where the warp makes belief a tangible force and faith can literally move mountains, that belief might not be entirely misplaced. The Snakebites, the most traditional of the Orc clans, would produce perhaps the most well-adjusted version of the Orc-raised human. The Snakebites are the Orcs who cling to the old ways, who ride squigs and distrust high technology, who live close to the land in a way that the other clans find quaint and slightly embarrassing. They are the farmers and herders of Orc society, the ones who tend the squig herds and cultivate the fungal gardens that provide the basic foodstuffs of greenskin civilization. Among the Snakebites, the human would learn skills that were closer to its species' own evolutionary heritage than anything the other clans could offer. Animal husbandry, agriculture, the art of reading weather patterns and understanding ecosystems. The Snakebite's human would be a ranch hand, a shepherd, a being whose daily life involved working with living things rather than killing them. And this experience, this daily contact with the slower rhythms of life, might provide a counterbalance to the violence that permeated every other aspect of its existence. The Snakebite's human would be calmer than its counterparts in other clans, more patient, more reflective, and possibly more at peace with its strange position in the universe. Each of these versions of the Orc-raised human would be a unique individual, shaped by the specific culture of the clan that raised it, carrying within it a combination of human and Orcish traits that no one could have predicted and no one could replicate. They would be, collectively, on a spectrum of possibility, a range of answers to the question of what happens when human potential meets greenskin culture, each answer as valid and as tragic as the others. But let us bring this exploration to its close, because we have wandered far and wide through the possibilities of this thought experiment, and it is time to gather our thoughts and draw our conclusions. The question we started with was simple. What would happen if Orcs raised a human child? The answer, as we have seen, is anything but simple. It is a sprawling, multifaceted, deeply unsettling exploration of identity, belonging, survival, and the nature of the human spirit. The Orc-raised human would be a creature of contradictions, a being that existed at the intersection of two incompatible worldviews, carrying within it the knowledge and the pain of both, as it would be tough enough to survive in a world of casual violence, cunning enough to find a place in a society that had no place for it, and human enough to suffer from the awareness that it was forever different from everything around it. It would speak the language of the Orcs with native fluency, but it would dream in a language it did not understand, a language of emotion and introspection that the greenskin vocabulary could not express. It would fight with the ferocity of a being raised among the galaxy's most violent species. But it would feel each death it caused in a way that no orc ever could, carrying the weight of every kill not as a trophy, but as a burden. It would pray to Gork and Mork, because those were the only gods it knew. But somewhere in the depths of its consciousness, in the place where the human soul resides, it would feel the pull of something else, something older and more complex than the twin green-skin gods, something that whispered of a purpose and a belonging that it could never quite grasp. And in the end, whether it died in battle or was captured by the Imperium, or somehow found its way back to human civilization, it would leave behind a legacy that was uniquely its own. A legacy of resilience, of adaptability, of the stubborn, beautiful, heartbreaking human insistence on surviving and growing and becoming, even in the most hostile environment imaginable. A legacy that said, in a voice that was both human and orcish, both familiar and alien, I was here, I existed, I mattered. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, that is no small thing. It is, in fact, everything. Sure, and that brings us to the end of this thought experiment, this long and winding journey through one of the strangest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We have explored the biology of the Orks, the structure of their society, the nature of their psychic gestalt field, the precedent of the Diggers on Gorkamorka, the specific cultures of the 6 major clans, the psychological and physical development of a human raised from infancy among greenskins, and the implications of such a life for both species and for the galaxy at large. We have asked the question that nobody asks, and we have found that the answer is not a fact, but a story of survival and transformation and loss, and the endurance of the human spirit in the face of impossible odds. It is a story that has no happy ending, because in the 41st millennium, happy endings are a luxury that the universe cannot afford. But it is a story that has meaning, a story that tells us something about what it means to be human, about the power of culture to shape identity, about the bonds that form between beings who have nothing in common except the shared experience of being alive in a universe that is trying very hard to kill them. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. That humanity, the essential quality that makes us who we are, is not a matter of genetics or culture or religion or language. It is something deeper, something more fundamental, something that survives even the most extreme forms of cultural displacement and environmental pressure. It is the capacity for self-reflection, for empathy, for the kind of suffering that comes only from being aware of one's own existence. It is the thing that the Orks, for all their power and all their success, will never possess, and the thing that the Orc-raised human, for all its cultural conditioning, will never lose. In the grim darkness of the far future, that capacity is both a curse and a gift, both the source of our greatest pain and the foundation of our greatest strength. It is what makes us vulnerable to the horrors of the universe, and it is what gives us the will to endure them. It is, in the final analysis, the only thing that truly belongs to us, the one possession that no alien, no god, no force in the galaxy can take away. The Orc-raised human would know this. It would know it in its bones, in the scars that mapped its body, in the dreams that haunted its sleep. It would know it because it would live it every day in a world that was not its own, us surrounded by beings that could never understand it, carrying a burden that could never be shared. And it would keep going. It would keep surviving, keep fighting, keep being human, because that is what humans do. It is what we have always done. It is what we will always do, no matter how dark the path before us becomes. But we have not yet fully explored some of the most fascinating and disturbing dimensions of this thought experiment. We have discussed the broad strokes, the psychological arc, the cultural transformation, the physical development. But there are specific scenarios, specific moments, specific encounters that deserve their own detailed examination, because it is in the details that the true horror and the true beauty of this story reveal themselves. Let us talk about the first time the orc-raised human sees another human being. Not a corpse on a battlefield, not a distant figure through the smoke of a burning city, but a living, breathing, speaking human being, up close and personal, for the first time in its conscious memory. This moment would be seismic. It would be an earthquake in the landscape of the human's inner life, a rupture in the carefully constructed identity that had sustained it through years of greenskin existence. Because the human would look at this other person, this stranger who shared its pink skin and its flat teeth and its strange, expressive face, and it would feel something that it had never felt before. Recognition. Not intellectual recognition, not the taxonomic awareness that says this creature is the same species as me, but something deeper. Something primal, something that reaches back through millions of years of evolutionary history to the earliest days of human social bonding. The human would feel, for the first time in its life, that it was not alone, that somewhere in the galaxy there were others like it, others who moved the way it moved, whose faces made the expressions its face made, whose eyes held the same quality of awareness and inner life that it saw when it looked into a pool of still water. The feeling would be overwhelming, disorienting, almost physically painful in its intensity, like a deaf person hearing music for the first time, like a blind person seeing the sun. And the other human, the normal human, the one who had been raised in human society and had never known anything else, would look back at the orc-raised human and see a monster. It would see a lean, scarred, filthy creature dressed in the crude armor and trophies of the greenskins, speaking a guttural alien language, moving with the predatory confidence of something that had grown up among killers. It would see everything it had been taught to fear and hate, everything the Imperial Creed warned against, everything that represented the failure of human civilization to protect its own. It would see a lost soul, a fallen being, a creature that had been consumed by the alien and remade in its image. The gulf between these two perceptions, between what the orc-raised human feels when it looks at a normal human and what the normal human feels when it looks back, is the essence of the tragedy we are exploring. It is the distance between reaching out and being pushed away, between the desperate need for connection and the inability to form it, between the human heart's capacity for hope and the universe's capacity for crushing it. How would this encounter play out? The specifics would depend on the circumstances. If the encounter happened during a battle, the other human would be an enemy, a soldier of the Imperium fighting against the orc warband that the orc-raised human belonged to. In this scenario, the orc-raised human might find itself in the most painful position imaginable, forced to fight against a member of its own species, in defense of the alien culture that raised it. The emotional toll of this experience, the knowledge that it was killing creatures that shared its own blood and bone and genetic destiny, would be enormous, and a wound that no painboy could treat, and no amount of fungus beer could dull. If the encounter happened during a raid, the other human might be a civilian, a farmer, or a worker on a world that the orcs were in the process of conquering. The orc-raised human, accompanying the warband as a scout or translator, would watch as the orcs swept through the settlement, killing some, enslaving others, looting everything that was not nailed down. And in the chaos, it might lock eyes with a civilian who was being dragged away by a group of laughing Gretchen, and something in that person's eyes, some quality of terror and despair and desperate, futile hope, would cut through the layers of orc conditioning and strike directly at the human core that the greenskins had never been able to touch. What would the orc-raised human do in that moment? Would it look away, as it had been trained to do, suppressing the uncomfortable feelings and focusing on the task at hand? Would it intervene, stepping between the civilian and the Gretchen, using its position in the warband to claim the human as its own property and thereby saving its life, at least temporarily? Or would it simply stand there, frozen, paralyzed by the collision of two irreconcilable impulses? The orc-trained warrior, that said this is just business, and the human consciousness that screamed this is wrong? The answer would depend on the individual, on the specific circumstances, on the strength of the human's conditioning versus the depth of its buried humanity. But whatever the answer, the encounter would leave a mark, a psychic scar that would never fully heal, on a memory that would return in dreams and quiet moments for the rest of the human's life. And this brings us to an aspect of the orc-raised human's existence that we have not yet fully explored, one that is perhaps the most deeply personal and the most universally relatable of all the topics we have covered. We need to talk about dreams. Orcs do not dream. Their brains, designed for combat and little else, do not produce the complex neural activity that generates the vivid, narrative-driven dreams that human beings experience during sleep. When an orc sleeps, which it does only when there is nothing better to do, its brain enters a state of minimal activity, a biological standby mode that conserves energy without producing any conscious experience. The human brain is different. The human brain dreams prolifically and vividly, processing the events of the day, consolidating memories, working through emotional conflicts, and generating the rich, strange, often nonsensical narratives that fill our sleeping hours. The orc-raised human would dream every night, and those dreams would be the one space in its entire life where the orc conditioning could not follow, the one place where the buried human consciousness could express itself freely, without the constraints of greenskin culture and the survival imperatives of orc society. What would the human dream about? In the early years, probably nothing unusual. Children's dreams, simple and often frightening, reflecting the daily anxieties of a life lived in constant danger. Dreams about being chased by squigs, about falling from high places, about the roar of an angry orc, and the desperate scramble for safety. But as the human grew older, as its brain matured and its capacity for abstract thought expanded, the dreams would begin to change. They would become more complex, more symbolic, more laden with the kind of emotional content that the human's waking life could not accommodate. The human might dream about vast, echoing spaces that were unlike anything in the orc settlement, grand halls and quiet rooms and sunlit gardens that came from somewhere deeper than memory, from the genetic heritage of a species that had been building civilization for thousands of years. It might dream about faces that it had never seen, human faces, kind faces, faces that looked at it with an expression that it could not identify in its waking vocabulary, but that its sleeping mind recognized as love. These dreams would be both a comfort and a torment. A comfort because they provided the emotional sustenance that the human's waking life could not. A torment because they showed the human a world that it could never access, a life that it could never live, a version of itself that it could never become. Each morning, waking from a particularly vivid dream, the human would feel the loss of that imagined world like a physical pain, a sharp, hot ache in the center of its chest that took hours to fade. And each night, falling asleep to the sounds of the orc settlement, the human would hope, with a hope that it could not name and could not suppress, that the dreams would come again. The Gretchen who shared the human's sleeping quarters would notice, occasionally, that the human moved and muttered in its sleep, making sounds that were not orcish. The sounds that came from a language the Gretchen did not recognize. They would poke the human awake sometimes when the sounds became too loud, because noise attracts attention, and attention in an orc camp rarely leads anywhere good. And the human, jolted from its dream world back into the harsh reality of its waking life, would lie in the darkness, breathing hard, trying to hold on to the fragments of the dream before they dissolved like morning dew in sunlight. These dreams, this rich and secret inner life, would be the human's greatest treasure and its most closely guarded secret. It would never speak of them to the orcs, because the orcs would not understand and would probably mock what they could not comprehend. It would never speak of them to the Gretchen, because the Gretchen, for all their cunning, or lacked the emotional depth to appreciate what the dreams meant. The human would carry its dream life inside itself, like a fire in a lantern, sheltered from the wind, tended with care, the last flickering remnant of a humanity that the greenskins had almost, but not quite, managed to extinguish. Let us now examine another critical dimension of this experience, the practical realities of daily existence. Because the details of daily life, the routines and rituals and small survival challenges that fill the hours between battles, are what truly define a person's experience, and the orc-raised human's daily life would be unlike anything that any other human being in the galaxy has ever known. A typical day in an orc settlement begins with noise. There is no dawn chorus in an orc camp, no gentle awakening. There is simply noise, the sudden, explosive cacophony of orcs beginning their day, which typically involves shouting, fighting, the firing of weapons at targets both real and imaginary, and the crash of heavy machinery being started up by mech boys, who believe that the best way to wake an engine is to hit it with a wrench until it cooperates. The human would wake to this noise the way it woke to everything else in its life, abruptly and defensively, rolling out of its sleeping spot and immediately scanning its surroundings for threats. This hypervigilance, this constant state of alertness, would be so deeply ingrained by years of conditioning that it would be automatic, as natural and as unconscious as breathing. Breakfast would be a competitive affair. Food in an orc settlement is not distributed equitably, yet it is seized by those strong enough to take it and defended by those clever enough to keep it. The human would rely on a combination of speed, timing, and alliances with sympathetic Gretchen to secure its morning meal. This meal would typically consist of some variety of fungus, prepared in whatever fashion the camp's Gretchen cooks had managed to achieve, supplemented by squig meat if the human was lucky, or by whatever scraps it had managed to stash away from the previous evening. After breakfast, the human's day would be filled with whatever tasks its role demanded. If it worked in a mech boy's workshop, it would spend hours hunched over workbenches, using tools designed for hands twice the size of its own. The work would be physically demanding, requiring a combination of strength, endurance, and fine motor control that pushed the human's body to its limits. The workshop itself would be hazardous, filled with toxic fumes, sharp edges, unstable chemicals, and the ever-present risk of an experimental device detonating without warning. The evenings would bring a different kind of challenge. As the day's work ended, the settlement would shift into a more relaxed but equally dangerous atmosphere, as orcs gathered in groups to drink fungus beer, tell stories, gamble on fights, and generally engage in the kind of rowdy socializing that, among greenskins, is only slightly less violent than actual warfare. The human would navigate these social gatherings with alertness and care. It would drink the fungus beer, because refusing would mark it as an outsider, though the effect of the orcoid brew on human biology would produce a buzzing, and slightly hallucinogenic intoxication that was more disorienting than pleasant. It would listen to the stories, the boasting, and the tall tales that formed the oral tradition of orc culture. It would participate in the gambling, using its human mathematics, its ability to calculate odds and remember outcomes, to give it an edge that the Gretchen bookmakers would find both impressive and infuriating. And in the quiet moments, when the camp settled into something approaching calm, and the sounds of snoring orcs replaced the sounds of fighting orcs, the human would be alone with its thoughts, alone with the questions that no one else in the settlement would ever think to ask. Let us also consider the question of language in greater depth, because the orc-raised human's relationship with language would be one of the most complex and revealing aspects of its existence. Orcish is not a language in the way that Low Gothic or High Gothic is a language. It does not have a formal grammar. It does not have a written form, although orcs do use a system of glyphs and pictographs that convey basic concepts like danger, territory, and the identity of specific warbands. Orcish is primarily an oral language, transmitted through the genetic memory encoded into the orc genome, supplemented by regional dialects and expressions that develop within individual settlements. The vocabulary is heavily weighted toward concepts of violence, hierarchy, and material acquisition. There are words for every type of weapon, every style of combat, every grade of loot. There are elaborate insults and boasts that serve as a form of social currency, but there is very little vocabulary for abstract concepts, for emotional states, for philosophical inquiry. This linguistic limitation would shape the human's thought processes in profound ways. The human would think in Orkish, because Orkish is the language in which its thoughts first formed. And thinking in Orkish would mean thinking in concrete, physical, action-oriented terms, seeing the world as a collection of things to be seized, enemies to be fought, and obstacles to be overcome. But the human brain, with its capacity for abstraction and metaphor, would constantly push against these boundaries. The human might develop a private vocabulary and a personal language of invented words and repurposed Orkish terms that it used to describe inner experiences that the official language could not accommodate. A word for the ache it felt when watching the stars. A word for the strange feeling when encountering another human for the first time. A word for the dreams that came at night and left it feeling hollow in the morning. This private language would be the human's most intimate creation, more personal than its scars, more revealing than its fighting style, more uniquely its own than anything else it possessed. A language spoken by one person and understood by no one, a monument to the human mind's refusal to be limited by the tools it has been given. There is also the matter of the human's relationship with the Orks' technology of belief. There's a relationship that deserves closer examination because it touches on the most fundamental questions about consciousness and the power of conviction in the 41st millennium. We have discussed the Gestalt field, but we have not fully explored what it means for a human to grow up within it, absorbing its effects from infancy, developing in an environment where belief has tangible, measurable impact on physical reality. In the Imperium, the relationship between belief and reality is well understood if rarely acknowledged. The Emperor sits upon the golden throne, sustained in part by the faith of trillions. The Chaos Gods are sustained by the emotions of sentient creatures. Belief in the 40,000 universe is not passive. It is an active force. The Orc-raised human would grow up in an environment where the power of belief is demonstrated every single day, in every functioning weapon and every running engine. The human would internalize this lesson, that conviction matters, that believing in something hard enough can make it real, that the universe is malleable, responsive to the concentrated will of those who inhabit it. This belief, combined with the human brain's natural psychic potential, might produce effects that could not be easily explained. The human might find that its weapons functioned slightly better than expected, not because it was contributing to the Gestalt field in any Orkoid sense, but because its own belief was exerting a subtle psychic influence. The human might find that its body responded to its convictions in ways that bordered on the miraculous, recovering from injuries faster than expected, performing physical feats that exceeded its normal capabilities. These effects would be subtle, barely perceptible, easily dismissed as coincidence or adrenaline or simple luck. But they would be real, a quiet testament to the power of a human mind raised in an environment where belief and reality are more intimately connected than anywhere else in the galaxy. And this raises perhaps the most speculative and the most tantalizing possibility of our entire thought experiment. Could the Orc-raised human, immersed in the Gestalt field from birth, develop a form of psychic ability that was neither purely human nor purely Orcish, but something entirely new? And could the combination of human psychic potential and Orc Gestalt resonance produce a hybrid form of psychic expression that had never been seen before in the galaxy? The answer, honestly, is that we do not know. The law provides no precedent for such a development, and any answer we give would be purely speculative. But the possibility is tantalizing, and it speaks to the broader theme of our thought experiment. The idea that when two fundamentally different forms of consciousness are brought into close and prolonged contact, the results are unpredictable, potentially dangerous, and always interesting. An inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, encountering such a being would face a dilemma of historic proportions. Here would be a human with the potential to unlock the secrets of the Ork Gestalt field, for it to provide insights into Ork psychology and technology that could save billions of Imperial lives. But here would also be a being whose very existence challenged the foundations of Imperial ideology, a human who had been raised by aliens and who had developed psychic abilities that were entangled with alien consciousness. The Inquisitor would have to weigh the potential benefits against the potential risks, and in the paranoid, zero-sum world of the Inquisition, the risks would almost always win. But let us not end on a note of despair. Let us instead consider the possibility, however remote, however unlikely, however incompatible with the grim darkness of the setting we are exploring, that the Ork-raised human's story might contain within it a seed of something positive, something that points toward a future that is not quite as dark as the present. Because the Ork-raised human, for all its suffering, for all its isolation, for all its existential dislocation, represents something that the galaxy desperately needs. It represents understanding. It represents the possibility that the gap between species can be bridged, that the hatred and the fear that drive the endless wars of the 41st millennium are not inevitable, that somewhere in the vast, blood-soaked landscape of galactic conflict, there is a space for something other than violence. The human knows the Orks. It knows them not as the Imperium knows them, as a faceless green horde to be exterminated, but as individuals, as a culture, as beings with their own values and their own way of being in the universe. It knows their strengths and their weaknesses, their joys and their fears, the things that motivate them and the things that terrify them. And it knows, from the deepest level of lived experience, that the Orks are not simply monsters. They are something more complex, something more interesting, something more worthy of study and understanding than the Imperial war machine has ever been willing to acknowledge. This knowledge, if it were ever disseminated, if it ever reached the ears of Imperial commanders and Inquisitors who were wise enough to listen, could change the way humanity fights the Orks. Not by making the wars less violent, because the 41st millennium does not allow for such luxuries, but by making them more effective. A commander who understands Ork psychology, who knows how to exploit the weaknesses of greenskin culture, who can predict the behavior of Ork warbands with the kind of accuracy that only insider knowledge can provide, would be a commander who wins battles that other commanders would lose. The Ork-raised human is, in this sense, a weapon. Not a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of understanding. A being whose unique perspective could be turned to humanity's advantage if anyone had the courage and the wisdom to use it. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where every advantage is precious and every insight is a potential lifeline, the value of such a weapon cannot be overstated. But weapons, in the 40,000 universe, have a tendency to be feared and destroyed by the very people who most need them. And so, the Ork-raised human's knowledge, its understanding, its unique perspective on one of humanity's oldest and most persistent enemies, would most likely die with it, unshared and unappreciated, another casualty of the paranoia and the dogmatism that are as much a threat to human survival as any alien horde. Unless, of course, someone listens. Unless someone, somewhere, has the courage to look past the horror and the heresy and see the value in what the Ork-raised human has to offer. Unless someone understands that the universe is larger and more complicated than the Imperial creed acknowledges, that the truth is more nuanced than the propaganda suggests, and that the key to humanity's survival might lie not in the destruction of the alien, but in the understanding of it. It is a faint hope, the kind of hope that the 41st millennium specializes in crushing. But it is hope, nonetheless, and in the grim darkness of the far future, that hope is the rarest and most precious commodity of all. Now let us consider one final dimension of this thought experiment that brings together everything we have discussed into a single, crystallizing moment. Let us imagine the Ork-raised human at the peak of its capabilities, in the prime of its life, standing on the edge of a battlefield, looking out at the two armies that are about to clash. On one side, the Orks, its Orks. The warband that raised it, the tribe that tolerated it, the green-skinned, tusk-faced, impossibly loud beings that constituted the only family it had ever known. They are arrayed for battle in the chaotic, undisciplined mass that is the Orkish way. At a sea of green bodies and crude weapons and vehicles that look like they were built by a committee of angry mechanics working without blueprints in a junkyard during an earthquake. They are chanting, stomping their feet, working themselves into the battle frenzy that Orks call the Great Green Tide, the building momentum of collective psychic energy that will, when it reaches its peak, explode outward in a wave of unstoppable violence. On the other side, the humans, its species, the Imperial Guard, or perhaps a regiment of planetary defense forces, lined up in orderly ranks behind fortifications and tank barriers, their faces grim and determined, their weapons clean and well-maintained, their discipline and their faith and their love for their emperor holding them in place against the green tide that is about to break upon them. They are afraid, because anyone who is not afraid of an orc charge is either lying or insane. But they are holding, because that is what human soldiers do. They hold. And in the middle, standing in the no man's land between the two armies, is the human. Our human. The impossible creature, the walking contradiction, the being that belongs to both sides and neither, that speaks both languages and carries both cultures within its scarred and modified body. It stands there, in the moment before the violence begins, and it feels the pull of both worlds, the green and the gold, the alien and the familiar, the past and the impossible future. In this moment, the human sees, with a clarity that only comes at the threshold of violence, the full scope of what it is and what it represents. It is a bridge between two species that have been at war for tens of thousands of years. It is a living proof that the boundaries between alien and human are not as fixed and as absolute as either side believes. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected complexities of orc culture. And it is alone, utterly and completely alone, the only being in the galaxy that can see what it sees, that can understand what it understands, that can feel what it feels. The moment passes. The orcs charge. The humans open fire. The no man's land becomes a killing ground. And the orc-raised human, with a shout that is half battle cry and half wordless scream of anguish, throws itself into the fray. Because that is what it was raised to do. Because that is the only thing it knows. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and even the most extraordinary beings must eventually choose a side. Which side does it choose? That is a question that each listener must answer for themselves, because the answer reveals not just something about the orc-raised human, but something about the person who imagines it. Do you believe that blood is thicker than culture? Do you believe that the bonds of upbringing outweigh the bonds of biology? Do you believe that a human can truly become something other than human? Or do you believe that the essence of humanity is indelible, unbreakable, present in every person, no matter how far they have strayed from the path? These are the questions that the orc-raised human's story is really about. Not questions about orc biology or imperial politics or the mechanics of the Gestalt field, but questions about us, or about what it means to be human, about the nature of identity and belonging, and the inescapable need to know where we fit in the grand scheme of things. And the answers, like all the best answers, are not simple. The orc-raised human is a mirror, and what we see in it depends on what we bring to the looking. It is a story about loss, about the things that are taken from us when we are too young to choose. It is a story about adaptation, about the remarkable capacity of the human mind to survive and even thrive in environments that should destroy it. It is a story about loneliness, about the particular pain of being a species of one, understood by no one, belonging nowhere. And it is a story about hope, about the stubborn, irrational, utterly human refusal to accept that this is all there is, that the darkness is everything, that the war will never end. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But within that war, within the blood and the noise and the endless, grinding cycle of violence, there are stories. Stories of courage and cowardice, of sacrifice and betrayal, of love found and love lost, and love that was never given a chance to bloom. The story of the orc-raised human is one of these stories, and it is, in its own strange and terrible way, one of the most human stories the 41st millennium has to offer. Because at its heart, it is a story about what happens when you take everything away from a person, everything that they are supposed to be, everything that their species says they should be, and leave them with nothing but the raw material of consciousness and the unquenchable need to survive. Thus, what emerges from that crucible is not what anyone expected. It is not fully human, and it is not fully orc. It is something else, something new, something that the galaxy has never seen before and will probably never see again. And that something, that unprecedented, impossible, heartbreaking something, is worth knowing about. It is worth thinking about. And there is still more to explore, more ground to cover, more corners of this extraordinary thought experiment to illuminate. And I want to take you deeper still into the specifics that give this story its weight and its texture, because it is in the granular details of a life lived at the intersection of two civilizations that we find the moments which resonate most deeply with our own experience, however different our circumstances might be. Let us consider the matter of teeth. Not human teeth, though those play a role in this story as well, but orc teeth. The currency of greenskin civilization, the medium of exchange that drives the entire orc economy. And that would become, for the orc-raised human, both a measure of its value and a constant reminder of its difference. Orc teeth grow continuously throughout a greenskin's life, much like the teeth of a rodent. They are hard, they are durable, and they are, by greenskin convention, money. The economy of an orc settlement runs on teeth, with goods and services exchanged for the tusks and fangs that every orc carries in abundance. The value of a tooth is determined by its size, its condition, and the difficulty involved in extracting it from its original owner, which is to say that the biggest teeth, the ones that come from the biggest orcs, are worth the most, as while the smaller teeth of Gretchen and other runts are worth proportionally less. This economy presents an immediate and obvious problem for a human. Human teeth do not grow back. Human teeth are small, fragile, and finite. A human who loses a tooth in a fight or has one extracted by a pain boy as payment for services rendered has lost that tooth forever, diminishing its total wealth by an amount that cannot be recovered. The orc-raised human would learn very early in life to guard its teeth with the same fierce protectiveness that a miser guards his gold, because each tooth it lost was a tooth it could never replace. But the human would also learn that there are other ways to acquire teeth besides growing them. Teeth can be found on the battlefield, pulled from the jaws of fallen enemies. They can be earned through service and paid as wages by a nob or a war boss who values the human's contributions. They can be won in bets, and the human's mathematical ability would give it a significant advantage in the gambling games that are a major feature of orc social life. And they can be stolen, though stealing from an orc is a high-risk proposition that the human would undertake only when the potential reward justified the potential consequences, which, in an orc camp, typically involved being pummeled into a state of temporary unconsciousness. The human's relationship with the tooth economy would shape its behavior in subtle but important ways. It would develop a keen awareness of value, an ability to assess the worth of objects and services with the precision of a born accountant. It would become an expert negotiator, able to drive bargains that left the other party satisfied while ensuring that the human got the better end of the deal. And it would develop a habit of hoarding, of accumulating resources and hiding them in secret caches throughout the settlement, because in a world where wealth can be taken by force, the ability to conceal one's assets is a survival skill of the first order. This economic acumen would make the human a natural ally of the Gretchen, who are themselves the merchants and entrepreneurs of orc society. The Gretchen black market, that shadowy network of back-alley deals and under-the-table transactions that operates beneath the notice of the larger orcs, would be the human's natural habitat, the place where its human intelligence could be deployed most effectively and where its contributions would be most valued. Among the Gretchen traders and hustlers, the human would find something approaching a peer group, a community of sharp-witted survivors who understood the value of cunning and the importance of never, ever getting caught. The human would also develop a relationship with the pain boys that was more complex and more significant than we have previously discussed. We have touched on the pain boys' interest in the human as a research subject, but the relationship would extend far beyond simple scientific curiosity. A pain boy who had studied the human over a period of years, who had patched its wounds and modified its body and observed its development from childhood to adulthood, would develop a form of attachment that, while not love in any human sense, was something more than mere professional interest. Pain boys are driven by curiosity, by the desire to understand how things work, to take them apart and put them back together in new and interesting ways. The human, as a unique and irreplaceable specimen, would represent the ultimate challenge for a pain boy's skills, a puzzle that could never be fully solved, but that could be endlessly explored. The pain boy would take a certain pride in the human survival and development, viewing it as a testament to its own medical skill, a living advertisement for the pain boy's ability to keep even the most fragile of patients alive in the most hostile of environments. This relationship would have practical benefits for the human. A pain boy's protection, however motivated by self-interest, is a significant asset in an orc settlement. Other orcs are less likely to bother a creature that is known to be under the protection of a pain boy, or partly out of respect for the pain boy's skills, and partly out of fear of the pain boy's instruments, which are terrifying even to beings that are genetically engineered for combat. The human, walking through the settlement under the implicit shield of a pain boy's patronage, would enjoy a degree of safety that few non-orcs in the galaxy could claim. But the relationship would also carry risks. A pain boy's curiosity is not always benign, and the line between research and experimentation is one that pain boys cross regularly and without compunction. The human might find itself subjected to procedures that it did not consent to and did not want, modifications and surgeries that were motivated not by medical necessity, but by the pain boy's desire to see what would happen. These experiences would be traumatic, painful, and potentially dangerous, as leaving the human with physical modifications that it had not chosen and could not reverse. The cumulative effect of these modifications, combined with the general wear and tear of life in an orc settlement, would produce a body that was, by the time the human reached full maturity, a patchwork of organic and mechanical components. A bionic eye, perhaps, installed after a fight pit accident destroyed the original. A mechanical hand, grafted on to replace one that was crushed in a workshop accident. An internal implant of some kind, whose purpose the human never fully understood, but which seemed to regulate its heartbeat during periods of extreme physical stress. Each modification would be a story, a chapter in the ongoing narrative of the human's survival, and together they would create a physical form that was uniquely, or unmistakably, the product of a life lived at the intersection of human biology and orc technology. Let us also talk about what happens when the warband goes to war, because this is the context in which the orc-raised human's unique capabilities would be most dramatically displayed, and it is in the crucible of battle that the tensions and contradictions of its existence would be most acutely felt. When an orc warband mobilizes for war, the entire settlement transforms. The lazy, chaotic atmosphere of peacetime gives way to a focused, purposeful energy that is both exciting and terrifying. The war boss, who has spent the weeks or months of peace brawling with his nobs and eating prodigious quantities of squig meat, suddenly becomes a figure of genuine authority, his shouted commands cutting through the noise of the settlement like a blade through cloth. The mech boys work around the clock, hammering and welding and cursing as they rush to finish the vehicles and weapons that the warband will need. The Gretchens scurry frantically, packing supplies, sharpening blades, and trying very hard to make themselves useful enough that they won't be conscripted as ammunition carriers or living shields. And the orc-raised human, caught up in the momentum of the mobilization, would feel the Gestalt field surge around it like a rising tide, the collective excitement of thousands of orcs channeled through the psychic substrate that connects them all. The human would feel its own heart rate increase, its own muscles tense, its own breath quicken, not from fear but from something more complicated, and something that was part fear and part excitement and part the primal animal thrill of being part of something larger than itself. The human would know, intellectually, that this feeling was not its own, that it was borrowed from the Gestalt field, a psychic echo of the orc's collective battle lust. But knowing this would not diminish the feeling's power. The human would feel it, bone deep and inescapable, and it would respond to it in the only way it knew how, by preparing for war. The preparation would be thorough and methodical, reflecting the human's unique combination of orcish aggressiveness and human planning capacity. Where the orcs simply grabbed their weapons and charged toward the nearest transport, the human would check its equipment systematically, ensuring that every weapon was loaded, every piece of armor was secure, every contingency had been planned for. It would study whatever intelligence was available about the enemy, whether that intelligence came from captured prisoners, scouting reports, or the human's own observations during reconnaissance missions. It would formulate plans, backup plans, and backup plans for the backup plans, preparing for a range of scenarios that the orcs around it would never think to consider. This planning capacity, this ability to think ahead and prepare for the unexpected, would be the human's greatest contribution to the warband's military effectiveness. An orc warband that included a human strategist, however informal that role might be, would fight with a degree of coordination and adaptability that other warbands lacked. The human might not be able to direct the orcs in any formal sense, because orc battle tactics are more instinct than strategy, and the average orc boy is about as responsive to orders as a loaded gun rolling down a hill. But the human could influence the fight in subtle ways, positioning itself and its allies at key points, providing timely intelligence about enemy movements, and using its understanding of both orc and human psychology to anticipate how both sides would react to changing circumstances. In battle, the human would fight with a style that was entirely its own, a fusion of orc aggressiveness and human tactical thinking that made it a uniquely effective combatant within its particular niche. It would not charge headlong into the enemy the way an orc would, because its body could not survive that kind of punishment. Instead, it would move through the battle space with purpose and precision, all selecting targets carefully, engaging from positions of advantage and disengaging when the odds turned against it. It would be a ghost on the battlefield, appearing and disappearing, striking from unexpected angles, exploiting the chaos that always accompanies an orc assault to create opportunities that a more conventional fighter could never find. The orcs who fought alongside the human would come to depend on its contributions in ways they might not consciously acknowledge. They would notice that fights went better when the human was present, that objectives were secured more quickly, that enemy counterattacks were anticipated and blunted before they could develop momentum. They would attribute these improvements to the favor of Gork and Mork, because orcs attribute everything good to the favor of Gork and Mork. But the more observant among them, the nobs and the commandos, and the occasional unusually thoughtful war boss, would recognize the human's role and value it accordingly. After the battle, win or lose, the human would enter the phase of orc warfare that most humans never live to see, the aftermath. The looting, the repair of damaged equipment, the celebration of victory, or the bitter recrimination of defeat, the assessment of casualties and the redistribution of resources among the survivors. This phase is as much a part of orc warfare as the fighting itself, and the human's role in it would be significant. Its ability to assess the value of captured equipment, to identify useful technology among the debris of the battlefield, 8. To organize the distribution of loot in a way that minimized conflict and maximized the warband's overall effectiveness would make it an indispensable part of the post-battle process. The human would also serve as an interpreter during interactions with captured prisoners, a role that placed it in an exquisitely painful position. Standing between an orc interrogator and a terrified human captive, translating questions that were asked with casual brutality and answers that were given with desperate honesty, the human would be forced to confront the full horror of its situation. It was helping the orcs. It was facilitating the conquest and subjugation of its own species. It was using the language skills and the cultural knowledge that made it unique to serve the interests of a civilization that treated human beings as livestock, as slaves, and as fuel for the endless engine of greenskin warfare. The guilt of this realization, if and when it came, would be devastating. Not because the human had any illusions about the orcs, because it knew exactly what they were, had always known, had grown up surrounded by evidence of their casual brutality toward humans. But because the guilt would come with the understanding that it had been complicit, that its survival had come at a cost that could not be measured in teeth or scars, but in the suffering of others who looked like it, who shared its blood, who had done nothing to deserve the fate that the orcs, with the humans' help, had delivered to them. This guilt might be the catalyst for change, but the force that finally pushed the human out of the comfortable grooves of its orc-conditioned existence and into the terrifying unknown of self-determination. Or it might be the weight that finally broke it, the revelation that proved too heavy for even the most resilient human psyche to bear. The outcome would depend on the strength of the human's character, on the depth of the buried humanity that the orcs had never managed to fully suppress, and on the circumstances of the moment, the specific battle, the specific prisoners, the specific look in a captive's eyes that said, "I know what you are, and I do not understand how you can live with it." The story of the orc-raised human is not a story with a neat resolution, as it is not a story where the protagonist finds peace or achieves redemption, or solves the central problem of its existence through a climactic act of courage or self-sacrifice. It is a story that continues, day after day, battle after battle, question after question, with no clear ending and no clear moral, because life in the 41st millennium does not come with neat resolutions or clear morals. It comes with survival, and the choices we make in the service of that survival, and the consequences of those choices, which ripple outward through time and space in ways we can never fully predict or control. The orc-raised human would live with these consequences every day. It would wake each morning to the noise of the settlement, eat its meager breakfast, perform its duties, fight its battles, and lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of whatever makeshift shelter it called home, thinking the thoughts that no one else in the settlement could think, and feeling the feelings that no one else in the settlement could feel. And somewhere in those thoughts and feelings, somewhere in the private language that it had invented to describe the inner landscape that no one else could see, the human would find something that kept it going, something that made the next day bearable, the next battle survivable, the next question answerable, something that was neither orcish nor imperial, neither green nor gold, but simply, irreducibly, human. Call it resilience, call it stubbornness, call it the refusal to accept that this is all there is. Call it whatever you like. It is the thing that defines us, that separates us from the machines and the aliens and the gods. It's the thing that makes us who we are in all our beautiful, frustrating, endlessly complicated glory. The orc-raised human would know this thing. It would know it better than anyone, because it would have been tested by circumstances that most humans cannot imagine, and it would have emerged from those tests with its essential humanity intact. Not unchanged, not unscathed, not whole, but intact. Still there, still burning, still asking the questions that have no answers, still feeling the feelings that have no names, still dreaming the dreams that no one else can see. And that, in the final analysis, is the answer to our question. What would happen if orcs raised a human child? The orcs would try, in their crude and unconscious way, to make it one of their own. The universe would try, in its cold and indifferent way, to destroy it. And the human, standing at the intersection of these two forces, would do what humans have always done, what we have been doing since the first human ancestor looked up at the stars and wondered what they were. It would endure, it would grow, it would become something that no one expected and no one could have predicted, something that challenged the assumptions of both species and expanded the boundaries of what was considered possible in a galaxy that had long since stopped believing in possibilities. It would be, against all odds and in defiance of all expectations, exactly what it was. A human being, raised by orcs, living in a universe that had no place for it, making a place for itself through sheer force of will and the unquenchable human need to find meaning in the midst of chaos. And if that is not a story worth telling, I do not know what is. And before we truly part ways, there are a few more threads of this extraordinary narrative that deserve to be pulled, a few more corners of this impossible life that deserve to be illuminated. Let us consider something we have only briefly touched upon, the question of how the orc-raised human would handle the concept of death. Because death, in orc society, is treated in a manner so fundamentally different from the human understanding that the collision of these two perspectives within a single consciousness would produce some of the most profound and most disturbing moments of the human's inner life. For the orcs, death is not a tragedy. It is barely even an inconvenience. An orc who dies in battle has died in the manner most appropriate to its species, fulfilling the purpose for which it was created by the Old Ones millions of years ago. There is no mourning in orc society, no funeral rites, no period of grieving or reflection. When an orc falls, its companions loot the body, pull out the teeth, and move on. The dead orc's spores will scatter on the wind, and in time, new orcs will grow from them, continuing the endless cycle of violence and renewal that defines the green-skin species. Death, for an orc, is just the beginning of the next generation. It is compost. It is recycling. It is as natural and as unremarkable as the sun rising and setting. The human mind does not process death this way. The human mind attaches meaning to individual lives, forms bonds with specific individuals, and experiences the loss of those individuals as a genuine wound, on a subtraction from the sum of its existence that leaves a permanent scar. The orc-raised human, carrying a human brain within an orc cultural framework, would feel the deaths of its companions in ways that no one around it could understand or share. When a Gretchen that the human had grown up with, a fellow runt who had shared its sleeping quarters and its food and its whispered conversations in the dark, was crushed underfoot by an oblivious orc, or killed in the random violence that permeated daily life, the human would feel the loss. Not as the Gretchen's other companions felt it, as a momentary flicker of, well, that's unfortunate, before moving on to the next scam, but as a genuine grief, a hollowing out of the chest, a sadness that lingered for days and had no outlet, no rituals to contain it, but no words in its vocabulary to express it. This grief would be compounded by the knowledge that no one around the human shared it. The orcs would not understand why the humans seemed diminished after a companion's death. The Gretchen would shrug and move on, because Gretchen are programmed by their genetics to accept the disposability of individual lives as a fact of existence. The human would be alone in its sorrow, carrying a weight that it could not name and could not share. And this loneliness, this emotional isolation in the midst of a bustling, noisy, overwhelmingly social environment, would be one of the defining features of its existence. Over time, the human might develop its own private rituals for processing grief. Small, secret ceremonies performed in the darkness of its sleeping quarters, moments of silence and remembrance that were invisible to the orcs around it, but that carried enormous significance for the human's inner life. It might collect small tokens from its fallen companions, a Gretchen's favorite tool, a scrap of cloth from a fellow worker's apron, a particularly interesting stone that a snotling had once hoarded with fierce possessiveness. These tokens would be hidden away in the human's secret cache, not as wealth, but as memory, as evidence that specific individuals had existed and had mattered, at least to one person. This private practice of remembrance would be, in its own quiet way, one of the most profoundly human things the orc-raised human could do. It would be a defiance of the orcish attitude toward death, a rejection of the greenskin belief that individual lives are interchangeable and disposable, and a declaration that even in a world that placed no value on individual existence, the human heart insisted on valuing it anyway. And let us talk about something else that the human would encounter as it matured, something that would challenge its understanding of both orc culture and its own place within it. Let us talk about the Great Green Crusade, the gathering momentum of collective purpose that orcs call the Great Call, the rising tide of psychic energy and martial enthusiasm that periodically sweeps through greenskin civilization like a storm, drawing orcs from across light years to converge on a single point of action. The gathering of a great crusade is one of the most awesome and terrifying phenomena in the galaxy. It begins with a single war boss, usually one of unusual size and charisma, who has won enough victories and accumulated enough followers to achieve a critical mass of leadership. As this war boss's reputation grows, other warbands begin to converge on his location, drawn by the psychic pull of the Gestalt field and the universal orc instinct that says the biggest, loudest, most violent gathering is the one most worth joining. The convergence accelerates as more orcs arrive. Each new warband adds to the psychic energy of the gathering, which in turn attracts more orcs from greater distances, creating a feedback loop of escalating size and power. The mech boys work frantically to build ever larger and more elaborate war machines. The weird boys, those unfortunate orc psychers who channel the Gestalt field's energy whether they want to or not, begin to crackle with barely contained power, yet their eyes glowing green and their voices resonating with the force of a million orcish consciousnesses pressing against the boundaries of physical reality. And in the midst of this gathering storm, the orc-raised human would find itself swept up in something it had never experienced before, a psychic tidal wave of collective emotion that was unlike anything the human brain was designed to process. The Gestalt field, normally a background hum, a subtle pressure against the edges of consciousness, would become a roaring flood of psychic energy that washed over the human with the force of a physical blow. The human would feel the excitement, the anticipation, the fierce, joyful certainty that something magnificent and terrible was about to happen. It would feel the pull of the gathering, the same pull that drew orcs from across the sector, manifested in its human consciousness as an overwhelming urge to move, to act, to be part of something larger and more powerful than itself. It would feel, for the first time in its life, what the orcs felt every time the Gestalt field surged, the pure, undiluted ecstasy of being connected to something vast and ancient and unstoppable. And it would be terrified, because the human brain, unlike the orc brain, was not designed to handle this kind of psychic input. The flood of Gestalt energy would overwhelm the human's mental defenses, producing disorientation, hallucinations, and a terrifying loss of individual identity as the boundaries between self and collective blurred and dissolved. The human would struggle to maintain its sense of self, as to hold on to the private thoughts and personal memories that defined it as an individual, rather than a node in the greenskin Gestalt network. This struggle would be fierce, painful, and ultimately defining. If the human prevailed, if it managed to ride the wave of Gestalt energy without losing itself in it, it would emerge from the experience with a deeper understanding of the orc psyche than any imperial scholar had ever achieved. It would know, from direct personal experience, what the Gestalt field felt like from the inside, how it shaped orc behavior, how it drove the great crusades that were the defining feature of greenskin civilization. This knowledge would be worth more than a fleet of warships, more than a planet full of resources, more than any weapon the Imperium had ever devised. if the human did not prevail. As if the Gestalt energy proved too much for its human brain to process, the results would be catastrophic. The human might suffer permanent psychological damage, losing the ability to distinguish its own thoughts from the psychic noise of the Gestalt field. It might become a kind of involuntary weird boy, channeling the field's energy in uncontrolled and dangerous ways, a living conduit for psychic power that it could neither understand nor direct. Or it might simply break, its consciousness shattering under the pressure, like a glass vessel subjected to forces it was never designed to withstand, leaving behind a body that still breathed and moved, but that was, in every meaningful sense, empty. The possibility of this psychic catastrophe adds another layer of danger to the Ork-raised humans' already perilous existence. Every gathering of Orks, every surge of the Gestalt field, would be a potential death sentence, a moment when the very thing that made the human valuable, its immersion in Ork culture, could destroy it from the inside out. Let us also consider the human's relationship with the natural world of whatever planet it happened to inhabit, because this relationship would be another source of both comfort and alienation. Ork settlements, as we have discussed, exist within the broader context of the Orkoid ecosystem, a self-contained biological system that transforms the environment around it to suit greenskin needs. The fungal gardens, the squig pens, the fungus-choked waterways, and spore-laden air of an Ork settlement create an environment that is, in ecological terms, a complete biome, as alien to human biology as the surface of a gas giant. But beyond the borders of the settlement, the natural world of the host planet would persist, altered by the greenskin presence, but not entirely consumed by it. Forests, deserts, oceans, mountains, the geological and biological diversity of a living world would continue to exist outside the walls of the Ork camp, and the human, venturing beyond those walls on scouting missions or resource-gathering expeditions, would encounter environments that were more compatible with its own biology than anything inside the settlement. These encounters with the natural world would be moments of quiet revelation for the human. Standing on a hilltop, looking out across a landscape that was not covered in fungus or littered with scrap metal, the human might feel a stirring of something that it could not identify, a sense of rightness, of belonging, and of being in a place that its body was designed for. The air would be cleaner, the sounds would be softer, the light would be different, filtered through natural clouds rather than the smoky haze that hung over every Ork settlement. The human might find itself breathing deeper, standing straighter, feeling a physical relaxation that it had not known it was capable of. These moments of natural communion would be brief and infrequent, snatched between the demands of its duties and the ever-present danger of the surrounding environment. But they would matter. They would provide the human with a physical and emotional counterbalance to the harsh realities of Ork life, a reminder that the world was larger and more varied than the settlement suggested, that there were places where the air did not taste of fungus and the ground did not shake with the footsteps of 7-foot-tall, green-skinned warriors. The human might develop a habit of collecting natural objects during these excursions, seeds and stones and feathers, and the dried petals of flowers that grew in the spaces between greenskin territory and the wild. These objects would join the tokens of remembrance in the human's secret cache, forming a small and precious collection of things that belong to the world outside the settlement. Tangible proof that beauty existed somewhere in the universe, even if the human could only visit it in stolen moments between the demands of a life lived among monsters. This connection to the natural world would be another element of the human's identity that set it apart from its greenskin companions. Orks have no aesthetic appreciation for the natural world. They do not find beauty in a sunset or peace in a quiet forest. They see the natural world as a resource to be exploited, a terrain to be fought over, a backdrop for the endless drama of violence and conquest that constitutes their entire existence. The human's appreciation for the natural world, its ability to find meaning and comfort in the simple act of standing in a field and watching the wind move through the grass, would be incomprehensible to the Orks, another sign of the fundamental difference between its consciousness and theirs. And this difference, this persistent, ineradicable divergence between human and Ork ways of being in the world, it would be the engine that drove the human story forward, the force that prevented it from ever fully settling into its Ork identity, and that kept alive the possibility, however remote, of a different kind of life. Because as long as the human could feel the wind on its face and find beauty in the natural world, as long as it could dream and grieve and wonder, as long as the quiet voice of its human consciousness continued to whisper beneath the roar of the Gestalt field, the human remained human. Changed, yes, marked by its experiences in ways that could never be undone, but human, still human, always human. There is a concept in human psychology called the self, the coherent, continuous narrative that each person constructs from the raw material of their experiences, the story they tell themselves about who they are and why they matter. But this self is not fixed. It changes over time, adapting to new circumstances and new information, but it maintains a core of continuity that allows the individual to recognize itself across the span of years and decades to say, I am the same person I was yesterday and the day before and the year before that. The Ork-raised human self would be one of the most complex and most fragile constructions in the galaxy, built from materials that were never meant to go together, Ork customs and human emotions, greenskin language and human dreams, alien values and human empathy. This self would be a work of constant maintenance, a structure that required daily attention and daily effort to hold together against the forces that sought to pull it apart. Some days, the self would feel strong, coherent, integrated. The human would move through the settlement with confidence, performing its duties with competence, interacting with its companions with the easy familiarity of long association. On these days, the human would feel almost content, almost at peace, almost as if the strange and improbable life it was living was not merely survivable, but actually, in its own way, good. Other days, the self would feel fragile, threadbare, on the verge of dissolution. The human would wake from a dream about a life it had never lived and feel the crushing weight of its difference, the unbridgeable distance between what it was and what it might have been. On these days, the human would withdraw into itself, but going through the motions of its daily routine with mechanical precision, while its inner world churned with emotions it could not name and questions it could not answer. And on rare days, the self would simply break, overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of a lifetime of contradictions. The human would find a hidden corner of the settlement and cry, silently, desperately, for everything it had lost and everything it had never had, for the parents it would never know, and the childhood it was never given, for the human world that existed somewhere out among the stars, and that it might never see and might not recognize, even if it did. These moments of breakdown would be followed by moments of rebuilding, as the human pulled itself together, wiped its eyes, squared its shoulders, and went back out into the settlement to face another day. While this cycle, this endless oscillation between integration and disintegration, between strength and vulnerability, between the Ork outside and the human inside, would be the rhythm of the Ork-raised human's existence, as regular and as unavoidable as the beating of its own heart. And yet, through all of this, through the violence and the grief and the loneliness and the moments of quiet despair, the human would persist. It would persist because that is what humans do. We persist, we endure, we adapt. We find ways to go on, even when going on seems impossible, because somewhere deep in the architecture of the human brain, beneath the layers of culture and language and ideology that we pile on top of it, there is a mechanism that says, no, not yet, not today. There is more to do, more to see, more to be. The Ork-raised human would be the ultimate expression of this mechanism. The proof that the human capacity for endurance is not dependent on the comforts and supports of human civilization, but is intrinsic to the species itself, as fundamental as the beating of the heart and the firing of the neurons. Strip away everything else, the culture, the language, the religion, the community, and what you are left with is not an empty vessel, but a being that is still, against all odds, capable of finding meaning and purpose in the act of survival itself. This is the final lesson of the orc-raised human story, and it is a lesson that is as relevant to us, sitting here in our comfortable world, as it is to the fictional inhabitants of the grim darkness of the far future. The lesson is this: you are more than the circumstances that made you. You are more than the culture that shaped you. You are more than the language you speak, the gods you worship, the flag you salute, or the people you call your own. You are, at the very bottom, at the irreducible core, a human being, with all the strength and all the weakness and all the beautiful, terrible complexity that entails. And that, more than any weapon, more than any fortress, more than any god or emperor or alien war machine, is the thing that will see you through. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But within the war, within the chaos and the destruction and the endless grinding cycle of violence that consumes the galaxy, there is this. There is the human spirit. There is the capacity to endure, to adapt, to find meaning where none was intended, and beauty where none was designed. There is the stubborn, irrational, magnificently defiant insistence that life matters, that individual lives matter, that the story of a single consciousness, however small and however strange, is worth telling. The orc-raised human would know this. It would know it in a way that no one else in the galaxy could know it, because it would have lived it, breathed it, bled for it, every single day of its impossible, beautiful, terrible life. And if that is not enough to earn your like, your subscription, and your return visit to this channel, then I do not know what the galaxy would have to produce to impress you. Thank you. Truly, deeply, sincerely, thank you for being here, for listening, for caring about the stories that live in the spaces between the wars, in the quiet moments between the explosions, in the dreams of beings who were never supposed to dream. I will see you in the next one. Take care of each other, and remember, always, that you are more than the sum of your circumstances. Good night.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.